They were sent not to attack, but to stop a collapse. When the German offensive erupted in December of 1944, it did not look like a battle that could be shaped quickly. Snow-swallowed roads, fog-grounded aircraft. Units were struck while refitting or resting. The front did not retreat in an orderly line. It fragmented, leaving gaps where no defense existed at all. Into that chaos moved the 82nd Airborne Division. They did not arrive by parachute. They arrived by truck, on frozen roads, racing toward a crisis that was still unfolding. The division was rushed forward with little time to orient, little knowledge of what lay ahead, and almost no margin for error. Their mission was simple in words and brutal in reality: hold long enough for the front to stabilize. The terrain offered no comfort. The Ardennes in winter was a maze of forests, narrow roads, and villages that became instant strong points. Snow concealed movement, but also slowed it. Visibility collapsed. Communication became uncertain. For infantry, every tree line could hide an advance, or an ambush. The 82nd did not wait for clarity. They deployed immediately, often into defensive positions chosen under fire. Companies spread thin along road junctions and ridge lines. Foxholes were carved into frozen ground that resisted every shovel strike. Artillery was scarce. Air support was impossible. What the division had was discipline, cohesion, and experience under pressure. German forces pushed hard. Armor advanced along icy roads. Infantry infiltrated through woods. Probing attacks tested every position. The 82nd absorbed the pressure and refused to give ground easily. When positions were lost, they were contested. When lines bent, they anchored again. The division fought a defensive battle defined not by sweeping movement, but by stubborn resistance at critical points. Villages like St. Vith and countless unnamed crossroads became battlegrounds measured in hours gained and meters denied. The goal was not dramatic victory, it was delay. Every road held disrupted the German timetable. Every stand forced the offensive to burn fuel, ammunition, and momentum it could not replace. Conditions worsened with each passing day. Temperatures dropped, supplies ran low. Casualties mounted from exposure as much as enemy fire. And still, the 82nd held. They fought without tanks of their own. They fought without certainty of relief. They fought knowing that withdrawal might open routes the enemy could exploit. Their resistance helped shape the northern shoulder of the Bulge. By holding key terrain and forcing German forces to fight for every mile, the 82nd helped contain the offensive until air power returned and counterattacks could begin. The division did not break the German attack on its own. It helped make breaking it possible. The story of the 82nd Airborne in the Battle of the Bulge is not one of airborne spectacle. It is one of discipline under pressure, of infantry holding in winter without illusions, of soldiers used as a stabilizing force when momentum threatened to run away. They were dropped not from the sky, but into the worst moment of the war in the West, and they held. Before this continues, pause for a second and notice the temperature around you. Is the air warm, cool, or somewhere in between? And what part of the day has caught you listening? Early, late, or in the quiet middle? The Bulge was fought in cold that never loosened its grip. Let this one unfold where you are, without rushing it. This is the story of the 82nd Airborne in the Battle of the Bulge, where speed to the front, cohesion under fire, and refusal to collapse helped turn crisis into containment. December 15th, 1944. Camp Mourmelon, France. The poker game had been running for 3 hours. Major General James Morris Gavin, youngest divisional commander in the United States Army at just 37 years old, watched his officers laugh over their cards in the officers' tent, their breath visible in the cold air. Outside, 11,500 men of the 82nd Airborne Division sprawled across more than 20 rest camps throughout the French countryside, writing letters home, sleeping in actual beds for the first time in months, believing the war might actually be winding down. The intelligence report sitting on Gavin's desk said the German army was effectively destroyed, its offensive capability shattered beyond repair. Nobody in that tent, not even Gavin himself, knew that in less than 24 hours, those same intelligence assessments would prove catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. The cards kept falling, the men kept laughing, and across the German border, 200,000 enemy soldiers were moving into position for the largest, most desperate gamble of the entire war. The 82nd Airborne had earned its rest through blood. Since June 6th, D-Day, the division had suffered 4,596 casualties, roughly 50% of the men who had originally jumped into Normandy just 6 months earlier. They had jumped into Sicily in July 1943, where the airborne operation had descended into chaos with aircraft scattered across the Mediterranean, paratroopers landing miles from their objectives, and entire units fighting isolated battles for days before making contact with friendly forces. They had jumped again over Normandy, where Gavin himself had landed in a tree. He cut himself down under fire and spent the next 72 hours gathering scattered paratroopers and leading them through German-held territory. Most recently, they had jumped into Holland during Operation Market Garden in September, where the division had held a narrow corridor against overwhelming German counterattacks, suffering 2,898 killed, wounded, or missing in just 9 days of sustained combat. 3 jumps, 3 campaigns, 3 desperate battles where the division had been thrown against impossible odds and somehow survived. But survival came with a price that could be measured in empty bunks and unanswered letters. Private James Johnson, whom everyone called Red for the color of his hair, sat in his barracks writing a response to his mother's latest letter. She had asked him, just in that careful way mothers have when they're afraid of the answer, whether the war was really over for him now, whether he might be coming home for Christmas. Red stared at the words on the page, trying to find something truthful to say that wouldn't terrify her. He had jumped into Normandy and survived when 3 men in his stick had died before hitting the ground. He had fought in Holland and watched his best friend bleed out in a foxhole while German artillery hammered their positions for 16 straight hours. He had frostbite scars on both feet and a purple heart medal he kept at the bottom of his pack, because looking at it made him think too much about the men who hadn't made it far enough to receive one. The barracks around him buzzed with conversation, men betting on when they'd ship home, and planning what they'd do when the war ended, living in that strange twilight between combat and peace. Red finally wrote that he hoped to be home soon, knowing even as he formed the words that hope and certainty were very different things. In his command tent, Gavin studied the reports from Market Garden with the intensity of a man who understood that past mistakes could prevent future disasters. The operation had been sold to them as the war-winning stroke, a daring thrust through Holland that would put Allied armor across the Rhine and into Germany's industrial heartland before winter. Instead, it had become a grinding battle of attrition where British paratroopers at Arnhem were destroyed, where American airborne forces held exposed positions against German counterattacks. It's where the grand strategy had collapsed into desperate tactical fighting. The casualty figures haunted him. 2,898 men who had boarded aircraft full of confidence and determination, only to be killed or maimed or captured in a battle that achieved nothing it had promised to achieve. Gavin had learned something fundamental in Holland about the difference between optimistic planning and brutal reality, about how quickly certainty could transform into chaos when the enemy refused to cooperate with your assumptions. He had no way of knowing that this education was about to be tested in ways that would make Market Garden look like a minor skirmish. The 82nd's actual strength was a carefully maintained fiction. On paper, the division fielded roughly 15,000 men organized into 3 parachute infantry regiments, supporting artillery battalions, engineer companies, and all the logistics elements required to keep a modern military formation functioning. In reality, after 6 months of sustained combat, the division had 11,500 effectives scattered across more than 20 different camps throughout France. Some units were at 90% strength, others were barely at 60%. The replacement system had kept the division technically operational, but the new men arriving from training camps in England and the United States lacked the combat experience that separated survivors from casualties. They didn't know how to read terrain for German positions, how to identify the sound of incoming artillery by the pitch of its approach, how to move under fire without freezing or panicking. The veterans tried to teach them, but some lessons could only be learned through experience, and experience in combat meant exposure to death. The division was resting, yes, but it was also reconstituting itself, absorbing new men, training them, hoping there would be enough time before the next operation to turn replacements into paratroopers. Intelligence reports from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force told a story of German collapse. The estimates, prepared by professional intelligence officers analyzing every scrap of information from aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, radio intercepts, and resistance reports, concluded that German offensive capability had been effectively destroyed. The Wehrmacht had suffered catastrophic losses in Normandy, where entire army groups had been encircled and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. They had been driven out of France in a headlong retreat that left behind hundreds of thousands of prisoners and mountains of abandoned equipment. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been reduced to a shell of its former strength, unable to contest Allied air superiority. German industry was being hammered day and night by strategic bombing that destroyed factories, disrupted transportation networks, and killed the skilled workers needed to maintain production. Every rational analysis pointed to the same conclusion. Germany was finished. The war was entering its final phase. And the only question was how quickly the collapse would come. Nobody in Allied intelligence seriously considered the possibility that Hitler might launch a massive counteroffensive in winter conditions, using forces that supposedly didn't exist. Morale reports painted a picture of men convinced the war was nearly over. A survey conducted across multiple divisions in early December showed that 67% of American soldiers expected to be home by Christmas 1944, celebrating victory with their families, putting the war behind them. The optimism was understandable. Paris had been liberated in August. American forces were fighting on German soil. The Soviet Union was crushing German armies on the Eastern Front, advancing inexorably toward Berlin. Every piece of evidence suggested the war was entering its final chapter. Men made plans based on this assumption. They talked about what jobs they'd return to, what they'd do with their discharge bonuses, where they'd settle down. The Army encouraged this optimism because maintaining morale required giving soldiers something to fight toward, some vision of life beyond the combat zone. But optimism built on faulty intelligence is just another word for complacency, and complacency in war creates the conditions for disaster. Aerial reconnaissance photographs had captured something that nobody properly understood. The images, taken by high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft flying over western Germany in late November and early December, showed extensive troop movements in the areas behind the Siegfried Line, columns of vehicles, concentrations of armor, railway activities suggesting major logistical operations. The intelligence analysts who reviewed these photographs noted the activity but interpreted it as routine winter repositioning, perhaps defensive preparations against the expected Allied spring offensive. Nobody seriously considered that the Germans might be staging forces for an attack because the fundamental assessment of German capability said such an attack was impossible. The photographs were filed, noted, and largely forgotten. Years later, historians would look at those same images and see clearly what should have been obvious at the time. Germany was preparing for something big, but intelligence work is always clearer in hindsight when you know what you're looking for, when the disaster has already happened, and all that remains is figuring out how everyone missed the signs. The division's history weighed on every decision Gavin made. He had watched men die in Sicily because the airborne plan had been fundamentally flawed, with aircraft routes taking them over Allied naval forces that shot down American planes in the darkness, with drop zones so scattered that paratroopers spent days just trying to find their units. He had learned in Normandy that even when the plan worked perfectly on paper, the chaos of combat would shatter that perfection within minutes of contact with the enemy. That leadership meant adapting to circumstances that bore no resemblance to the pre-operation briefings. He had seen in Holland how strategic optimism could commit forces to operations that tactical reality could not support. How brave men could do everything right and still lose because the underlying assumptions were wrong. These experiences had taught him caution, skepticism about intelligence reports that seemed too good to be true, a bone-deep understanding that the enemy always got a vote in how battles developed. But even Gavin's hard-earned wisdom couldn't prepare him for what was coming because the scale of what Hitler was planning fell outside the reasonable boundaries of military logic. On the evening of December 15, 1944, the 82nd Airborne Division settled in for another quiet night. Men played cards, officers reviewed training schedules, maintenance crews serviced equipment. The ordinary business of a military unit at rest continued in that mundane rhythm that defines most of military life. The endless routine of preparation and administration that fills the spaces between combat. In Germany, less than 100 miles away, 200,000 German soldiers were conducting final preparations for an offensive that would shatter the winter quiet, transform the Western Front into a desperate crisis, and test the 82nd Airborne in ways that Sicily and Normandy and Holland had never managed. The poker game in the officers' tent continued. The cards fell. And in the darkness beyond the camps, history was preparing to prove that everything the intelligence reports had promised was catastrophically, lethally wrong. The quiet was about to end. The real test was about to begin. And nothing in the 82nd's brutal experience had prepared them for what was coming. November 10th, 1944. Wolf's Lair, at Rastenburg, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler stood before a map of the Western Front, his hands trembling slightly as he traced the route his armies would take through the Ardennes forest. The assembled generals watched in silence, some with barely concealed skepticism, others with the careful neutrality of men who had learned that disagreeing with the Führer could be fatal. Hitler's plan was audacious to the point of delusion: punch through the American lines in the Ardennes, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in half, and force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to focus all its strength against the Soviet Union in the East. The operation had a name that evoked defensive heroism rather than desperate aggression. Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, watch on the Rhine. But the generals looking at Hitler's map saw something very different from heroism. They saw a gamble that would consume Germany's last strategic reserves in a single throw of the dice, betting everything on achieving total surprise against an enemy that possessed overwhelming material superiority. Some believed it might work. Others knew it was madness. None dared say so directly. The plan required assembling forces that Germany supposedly no longer possessed. Hitler demanded 3 armies for the offensive: the 6th S Panzer Army under Josef Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger, totaling approximately 200,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and more than 3,000 artillery pieces. Both these forces would have to be assembled in complete secrecy, moved into staging areas without Allied reconnaissance detecting the movement, and then launched in a coordinated assault across a 90-mile front through terrain that was supposed to be impassable for armor in winter. The logistics alone were staggering. Every tank needed fuel, every artillery piece needed shells, every soldier needed food, ammunition, winter clothing, and the support infrastructure that kept modern armies functioning. Germany's industrial capacity had been hammered by years of strategic bombing. Its transportation networks were disrupted. Its fuel reserves were critically low. Assembling this force required stripping the Eastern Front of desperately needed reserves, halting defensive operations in Italy, and concentrating resources that were needed everywhere into a single operational sector. It was possible only if everything went exactly according to plan, and military history suggested that things rarely went exactly according to plan. The German High Command's assessment of American fighting capability revealed a fatal combination of racism and wishful thinking. Intelligence summaries prepared for Hitler characterized American soldiers as poorly motivated, lacking fighting spirit, dependent on material superiority rather than tactical skill, likely to collapse under concentrated pressure from veteran German forces. This assessment drew on early war encounters where inexperienced American units had performed poorly against seasoned German troops, but it ignored the brutal education American forces had received in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. It assumed that Americans would fight the way they had in 1942 rather than the way they had learned to fight by late 1944. German commanders convinced themselves that a hard blow delivered with sufficient force would shatter American defensive positions, because Americans lacked the iron will to stand and die when the situation became desperate. This comfortable delusion would prove catastrophically wrong, but in November 1944, planning the offensive in East Prussia, the German High Command believed their own propaganda about American weakness. They were planning an operation based on an enemy that existed more in their imagination than in reality. Weather would be Germany's secret weapon, the one factor that could neutralize Allied advantages in air power and artillery. The German Meteorological Service predicted that winter weather in the Ardennes would include extended periods of heavy cloud cover, fog, and snow that would ground Allied aircraft and reduce visibility to ranges where German forces could close with American positions before being detected. This forecast proved remarkably accurate. The Ardennes in December was a landscape of gray skies, frozen ground, and limited visibility that transformed Allied air superiority into a theoretical advantage rather than a practical one. German planners understood that they had perhaps 48 to 72 hours of weather protection, during which Allied tactical aircraft would be grounded, and strategic bombers unable to interdict German supply columns. If they could achieve breakthrough in that window, if they could get their armor through the American lines and into exploitation mode before the weather cleared, they might accomplish what months of defensive fighting had failed to achieve, fundamentally disrupting Allied offensive plans and buying time for Germany to develop the miracle weapons Hitler kept promising would turn the tide of the war. The actual strength Germany managed to assemble told a story of desperation masked as power. The 200,000 men committed to the offensive represented a significant force by any standard, but they were drawn from units that were already under strength, padded with teenagers from the Hitler Youth and older men from Volkssturm units, stiffened by a core of veterans who had survived years of combat and knew exactly how bad Germany's strategic situation had become. The 1,400 tanks included significant numbers of Panzer IVs and Panthers, formidable machines in competent hands, but also older models pressed back into service, and new Tigers that were mechanically unreliable and consumed fuel at rates Germany's shrinking petroleum reserves could barely sustain. The artillery park included the famous 88mm guns that had proven so effective throughout the war, but also older pieces and captured weapons that complicated ammunition supply. This was Germany's last mobile reserve, assembled through extraordinary effort, representing everything the Reich could scrape together for one final throw against the Western Allies. If it succeeded, the war might be prolonged. If it failed, Germany would have nothing left to stop the Allied advance into the Reich itself. Yet German intelligence estimates about Allied strength in the Ardennes proved remarkably accurate in the details, while being catastrophically wrong in the implications. The Germans correctly identified that approximately 83,000 American troops held the sector, spread thin across an extended front that had been quiet for months. They correctly assessed that most of these were either green divisions gaining experience in a quiet sector, or worn divisions recovering from heavy fighting elsewhere. They accurately mapped the dispositions, the gaps between units, the locations of command posts and supply dumps, but they fundamentally misread what these Americans would do when attacked. German intelligence assumed that green troops would panic, that worn troops would collapse, nay, that the extended American positions would disintegrate under concentrated assault by veteran German forces. They planned for breakthrough and exploitation, for American units fragmenting and retreating in disorder, for a repeat of the chaos that had followed German offensives in 1940 and 41, when Wehrmacht armor had smashed through French and Soviet positions. They did not plan for American units that would stand in place and die rather than retreat, that would fight from encirclement, that would disrupt the German timetable through sheer bloody-minded refusal to behave as defeated troops were supposed to behave. On November 27, 1944, Hitler issued the final operation order for Watch on the Rhine. The directive was characteristically grandiose in its strategic aims, and disturbingly vague about what would happen if those aims proved unachievable. The 6th SS Panzer Army would drive northwest toward Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army would support this thrust while seizing key river crossings, and the 7th Army would protect the southern flank against American counterattacks. Success depended on maintaining momentum, on the American defenses crumbling fast enough that German armor could reach the Meuse River before Allied reserves could seal the breakthrough. The operation order specified objectives, but provided minimal guidance on what commanders should do if resistance proved stronger than expected, if the weather window closed prematurely, if fuel supplies ran short, if any of the dozen critical assumptions underlying the plan turned out to be wrong. It was a plan that worked brilliantly if everything went right and had no real contingency for what would happen when things went wrong, which suggested either breathtaking confidence or breathtaking desperation. Given Germany's strategic situation in late 1944, desperation seemed the more likely explanation. The movement of forces into staging areas began in late November and continued through mid-December, an operation that required moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles through a transportation network that Allied bombing had already heavily damaged. German commanders used every trick they knew to maintain secrecy, moving at night, using forest cover, enforcing strict radio silence, began spreading disinformation about defensive preparations, establishing dummy headquarters and false communications to mislead Allied intelligence. The security measures worked better than anyone had a right to expect. Allied reconnaissance flights photographed increased activity, but interpreted it as defensive repositioning. Radio intercept stations detected unusual communication patterns, but couldn't break through the operational security that kept German intentions hidden. Human intelligence networks in occupied territories reported troop movements, but couldn't determine whether these represented a defensive buildup or offensive preparations. The Allies knew something was happening, but couldn't assemble the fragmentary clues into a coherent picture that would have revealed the scale of what Germany was preparing. The intelligence failure was total and collective, spread across multiple agencies and echelons, a failure of imagination rather than collection. By December 15, 1944, Germany's gamble was ready to be played. 200,000 men were in position. Ammunition had been stockpiled. Fuel, though dangerously limited, had been distributed to armored units for the initial assault. The weather forecast predicted the cloud cover that would ground Allied aircraft. The American sector chosen for the attack was thinly held and largely unprepared for major combat operations. Everything was as ready as it would ever be. In his headquarters, Hasso von Manteuffel studied the operational maps and felt the weight of what was about to begin. He had commanded armored forces on the Eastern Front, all where battles consumed entire armies and produced casualty figures that were almost incomprehensible. He understood what it meant to commit forces to a decisive operation, where success or failure would determine the fate of nations. He also understood, though he could never say this openly, that this offensive was less about winning the war than about delaying the inevitable. Germany could no longer win. The strategic balance had shifted too far. But perhaps if the offensive achieved enough surprise, if it inflicted enough casualties, if it disrupted Allied plans sufficiently, perhaps Germany could delay defeat long enough for some miracle to occur, some political settlement to emerge, some way to avoid the total destruction that unconditional surrender would bring. The offensive would begin before dawn on December 16th. And then they would discover whether Hitler's desperate gamble had any chance of success, or whether Germany had just committed its last reserves to a catastrophic failure that would hasten rather than delay the end. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the Ardennes forest. The artillery barrage began as a sound that American soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives. 100,000 shells in the first hour, fired from more than 3,000 German guns arrayed along a 90-mile front that stretched from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south. The shells came in waves, a rolling thunder that shattered the pre-dawn darkness, exploding in American positions that had been quiet for so long that many defenders had convinced themselves the war had moved elsewhere. Men were killed in their sleeping bags. Foxholes collapsed from near misses. Communications trenches disappeared under direct hits. The barrage was precise in some sectors, where German observers had mapped American positions over weeks of careful reconnaissance. It was random in others, where German artillery crews simply saturated likely defensive areas with high explosive and hoped for the best. Within minutes, the American defensive network in the Ardennes had been torn apart not through destruction of forces, but through destruction of communications. Command posts blown apart, telephone lines severed, radio antennas shattered, leaving company commanders isolated with no clear picture of what was happening beyond their immediate positions. Now, Private First Class Robert Harper of the 106th Infantry Division was eating breakfast when the world exploded. His unit held positions near the village of Bleauf, in what had been considered a quiet sector, perfect for Green divisions to gain combat experience without facing serious German opposition. Harper had been in Europe for 6 weeks, in combat for approximately 10 days, during which time his company had experienced exactly 2 casualties from random artillery fire. He understood war as an abstract concept more than a lived reality. The barrage changed that understanding in seconds. The first shells hit the company command post 200 yards behind his position, a structure that had been there so long it had acquired furniture and a working stove. The explosion was so massive that debris rained down on Harper's foxhole for nearly a minute. He pressed himself into frozen earth and tried to make sense of sounds that had no reference point in his experience. The shriek of incoming shells, the crack of explosions, the screams of wounded men, all blending into an overwhelming assault on his senses that made thought almost impossible. When the barrage finally lifted after 90 minutes, Harper climbed cautiously from his foxhole and looked toward where the command post had been. There was nothing left but a crater and scattered equipment. His company had effectively ceased to exist as an organized unit before the ground assault even began. 8 a.m. brought confirmation of what forward observers had been trying desperately to report through destroyed communications networks: tanks. And German armor was advancing in company and battalion strength across multiple sectors, supported by infantry that moved with the professional confidence of veterans who had been fighting since the invasion of Poland in 1939. The tanks were a mix of Panzer IVs and Panthers, backed by Tiger heavy tanks in some sectors, all moving forward through morning fog that reduced visibility and made accurate defensive fire almost impossible. American units that had prepared defensive positions for abstract attacks that might never come suddenly faced the reality of German armor, advancing at ranges where individual soldiers could see the commanders in the turrets, where the distinctive sound of German tank engines became impossible to ignore. Some American units held their fire as they had been trained, not waiting for the optimal moment to engage. Others opened fire immediately, driven by fear and the desperate need to do something, anything that might stop what was coming toward them. The American intelligence failure became apparent through radio transmissions that captured confusion, turning into comprehension, and then horror. A forward observer attempting to call for artillery support couldn't provide proper coordinates because his maps didn't show German units where German units obviously were. A company commander radioing for instructions received no response because division headquarters was simultaneously trying to make sense of reports from dozens of units, all describing German attacks, all requesting support, none of the reports fitting together into a coherent picture. A battalion intelligence officer listening to fragmentary radio traffic suddenly understood what nobody had wanted to believe. This wasn't a probe, wasn't a raid, wasn't a limited objective attack. This was an offensive, a coordinated multi-division assault along the entire Ardennes sector. The realization came too late to prevent the initial breakthrough, but early enough to begin the desperate improvisations that would eventually contain the German advance. Somewhere in the fog and confusion, American commanders stopped trying to defend according to pre-war plans and started defending according to immediate necessity. Gavin received the telephone call at division headquarters in Mourmelon at approximately 10 a.m. The voice on the other end belonged to a staff officer from 1st Army headquarters. And his message was simple and terrifying. Get your division ready to move immediately. Destination unknown. Priority highest. We'll have orders within hours. Gavin didn't ask questions because there was no time for questions. He had commanded paratroopers long enough to understand that destination unknown meant situation so fluid we don't know where you'll be needed most. And priority highest meant everything you thought you knew about the operational situation is wrong. He assembled his staff, issued movement orders, and set in motion the complex logistics of mobilizing an 11,500-man division that was scattered across more than 20 camps throughout the French countryside. The 82nd had mobility advantages that conventional infantry divisions lacked: lighter equipment, integrated transport, and training that emphasized rapid deployment. But even with those advantages, assembling a scattered division for immediate combat deployment was a task measured in hours rather than minutes. The question wasn't whether the 82nd could move. The question was whether they could move fast enough. Company and battalion commanders throughout the division began the organized chaos of combat preparation. Equipment that had been stored for maintenance was hastily distributed. Ammunition that had been inventoried in relaxed rear area conditions was now loaded into trucks under time pressure that eliminated careful accounting. Men who had been on pass in nearby towns were recalled by military police. Soldiers who had been sleeping or eating or writing letters were roused and told to prepare for immediate departure. Some units achieved remarkable speed, fully loaded and ready to move within 2 hours of receiving orders. Others struggled with vehicles that wouldn't start, equipment that couldn't be found, the inevitable friction that comes from trying to do complex tasks under time pressure without perfect information. But through it all, the division moved with a professional competence that came from having done this before, from Sicily and Normandy and Holland, from 3 combat jumps that had taught them how to function in chaos, because chaos was the natural state of airborne operations. By noon on December 16th, the initial German gains had produced a tactical picture that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. In the northern sector, German forces had advanced more than 20 miles, all overwhelming American positions that were too thinly held to provide mutual support, cutting roads that connected American units, creating pockets of isolated defenders who would have to fight alone until relief forces could break through. In the southern sector, the German advance was slower but equally relentless, grinding forward against American units that fell back in relatively good order, but couldn't maintain a continuous defensive line. The breakthrough had been achieved. The question now was whether German forces could exploit that breakthrough before American reserves arrived to seal the gaps. In German command posts, officers studied maps showing blue arrows representing the advance and felt cautious optimism that the plan might actually work. In American command posts, officers studied the same terrain and felt growing dread about how close this attack had come to achieving complete surprise. Captain Dale stood with his company at 10 a.m. and told them the truth without embellishment. "This is no drill, boys. This is real." His men had heard rumors, but rumors were different from confirmation coming from an officer they trusted. The poker games stopped. The letter writing stopped. The casual conversation that filled rest camps disappeared, replaced by the focused intensity of men preparing for combat. Some soldiers checked their weapons for the 10th time. Others organized their equipment with obsessive attention to detail, making sure every item was exactly where it should be. A few wrote quick last letters, just in case, or simple messages to families that said the things that become important when death stops being abstract. Dale watched his men transform from soldiers at rest into soldiers preparing for battle, and felt the familiar mixture of pride and dread that came from commanding young men who would follow him into combat, because that was their duty and their training, regardless of their personal fears. By mid-afternoon, December 16th, the scale of the German offensive had become clear to Allied headquarters. This was not a diversionary attack. This was not a limited objective operation. This was a massive, coordinated offensive involving multiple German armies with the clear intention of achieving strategic breakthrough. Eisenhower's staff at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force began the urgent task of identifying available reserves and positioning them to contain the German advance. The 82nd Airborne at Mourmelon represented one of the few divisions in theater that could move quickly and fight effectively upon arrival. They wouldn't be the only reinforcements sent to the Ardennes, but they would be among the first. And speed mattered more than anything else, because every hour the Germans had to exploit their breakthrough was an hour in which American positions became harder to establish, and German supply lines extended further into Allied-controlled territory. The race had begun. The 82nd was moving, and somewhere in the snowy forests of the Ardennes, German commanders were calculating whether they could reach their objectives before American reinforcements arrived. The answer to that question would determine whether Hitler's desperate gamble produced a strategic miracle or a catastrophic failure that would accelerate Germany's final defeat. December 16, 1944. 2 p.m. Mourmelon, France. The orders arrived with brutal simplicity. Bastogne. The 82nd Airborne would deploy immediately to the town of Bastogne in Belgium, a road junction nobody in the division had heard of, but which was apparently critical to stopping the German offensive. Gavin studied the map and understood immediately why Bastogne mattered. 7 roads converged there, roads the Germans needed to move their armor west toward the Meuse River and eventually to Antwerp. Control those roads and you controlled movement through the entire southern sector of the battlefield. Lose those roads and German armor could bypass American defensive positions, flowing through the gaps like water-finding paths of least resistance. The race to Bastogne wasn't about defending a town. It was about defending the geometry of the battlefield itself, about occupying terrain before the enemy could, about winning a competition measured in hours where second place meant tactical disaster. Gavin had 17 hours to move his division 110 miles north into combat. Units that were faster would arrive first and face the enemy with whatever strength they possessed. Units that were slower might arrive to find the battle already lost. The loading scenes throughout the division represented organized chaos functioning at maximum efficiency. Men threw duffel bags into trucks without the careful inventory procedures that characterize peacetime operations. Ammunition crates were stacked in cargo beds and secured with whatever rope or straps were available. Officers checked manifests not to ensure perfect accounting, but to make sure each unit had enough bullets, enough food, enough medical supplies to fight independently if they became separated from higher headquarters. Some companies were ready in 2 hours, a remarkable achievement requiring perfect synchronization between dozens of men executing complex tasks simultaneously. Other companies took 4 or 5 hours, delayed by vehicles that wouldn't start in the December cold, or by equipment that had been stored in different locations and now needed to be assembled by the inevitable friction that emerges when complex systems operate under time pressure. But every unit moved as fast as humanly possible, driven by the understanding that somewhere ahead of them, Americans were fighting and dying while waiting for reinforcements that might not arrive in time. December the 17th, 3:30 a.m. The first C-47 transport planes lifted off from Mourmelon Airfield, carrying 2,000 paratroopers who would land at airfields near Bastogne and move directly into defensive positions. Flying at night violated almost every safety protocol in the Air Force handbook. But safety protocols assume normal circumstances, and these circumstances were anything but normal. The paratroopers sat in aircraft designed for parachute operations, but weren't carrying parachutes because they were going in as ground troops, landing at friendly airfields if those airfields remained friendly by the time they arrived. The roar of the engines made conversation impossible. Men sat with their thoughts, trying to process what was happening, trying to prepare mentally for combat they knew was coming, but couldn't predict in detail. Some slept through sheer exhaustion. Others stared at nothing and tried not to think about what they might find when they arrived. A few prayed, not elaborate prayers, but simple requests for survival, for courage, for the ability to do their duty without failing their brothers. Private Marcus Williams rode in a truck convoy that stretched for miles along snow-covered French roads. If a column of vehicles moving north through the night, with headlights extinguished to avoid German air attack. Williams had jumped into Normandy and survived when half his stick had been killed or wounded in the first 6 hours after landing. He had fought in Holland and learned that combat was less about heroism than about endurance, about continuing to function when every instinct screamed to find cover and stop moving. Now he was heading toward another battle with only fragmentary information about what they would face when they arrived. The soldier next to him asked whether Williams was scared. Williams thought about the question carefully before answering. "I'm always scared. You'd be crazy not to be scared, but being scared doesn't mean you can't do your job." The truck rolled on through darkness. In one vehicle in a convoy that represented not just transportation, but hope. The hope that American reinforcements could arrive before German forces completed their breakthrough. The hope that training and determination could overcome the disadvantage of arriving second to a battle already in progress. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the American convoys moving north, but lacked the strength to attack in force. The Luftwaffe had been carefully husbanded for the offensive, with fuel reserves allocated primarily to supporting ground operations, rather than interdicting Allied supply lines. Some German pilots made strafing runs, diving out of clouds to fire on truck columns and then climbing back into cloud cover before Allied fighters could respond. The attacks caused casualties, trucks burning on the roadside, many wounded men being transferred to other vehicles while the convoy continued moving. But the attacks couldn't stop the movement, couldn't prevent the flow of American reinforcements toward the critical sector where the battle's outcome would be determined. German commanders watching the American response understood that they had achieved surprise but not paralysis, that the Americans were reacting with a speed and professionalism that hadn't been anticipated in the pre-operation estimates. The window for exploitation was narrowing, the race was being lost, and nobody knew yet whether the Germans could achieve their objectives before that window closed completely. The convoy movement exposed the extraordinary complexity of modern warfare logistics. 380 truck sorties carrying men and equipment through winter weather on roads that were designed for farm traffic rather than military columns. 95 C-47 transport flights coordinated between Army requirements and Air Force capabilities, with aircraft being pulled from other missions and redirected to emergency airlift operations. Coordination between units at multiple command levels, ensuring that artillery would arrive in roughly the same time frame as the infantry they were supposed to support, that engineers would reach Bastogne before defensive positions needed to be constructed, that medical personnel and supplies would be available when casualties started arriving. Perfect coordination was impossible under these circumstances. The goal was adequate coordination, all enough synchronization that units could function together once they reached the battlefield, even if the careful organization shown in pre-war field manuals had been abandoned in favor of getting everyone moving in roughly the same direction as fast as humanly possible. Weather conditions complicated everything. Clear skies over Mourmelon allowed the air transports to take off safely, but weather in the Ardennes was deteriorating rapidly as winter storms moved through the region. Truck convoys encountered snow that reduced visibility and made roads treacherous. Aircraft flying troops toward Bastogne encountered turbulence that made soldiers airsick and forced pilots to rely on instruments rather than visual navigation. The cold itself became an enemy, and weapons that had functioned perfectly in the mild conditions of the rest camps, now requiring extra attention to keep operating in temperatures that dropped below freezing every night. Men who had been sleeping in heated barracks just days before now faced the prospect of fighting in winter conditions, without the opportunity to gradually acclimate to the cold. Frostbite would become as serious a threat as enemy fire. The division was racing toward combat in conditions that eliminated many of the advantages American forces had enjoyed in earlier campaigns. Air superiority meant nothing if weather grounded aircraft. Mechanical reliability meant nothing if vehicles froze. Superior logistics meant nothing if roads were blocked by snow or destroyed by German artillery. Gavin brought approximately 2,000 men on the first airlift. They had a calculated decision to get some forces to Bastogne as quickly as possible, rather than wait until the entire division could move together. The remainder would follow in waves through December 18th, 19th, and 20th, arriving as transportation became available and as the tactical situation permitted. This phased deployment meant the 82nd would be committed to battle piecemeal, individual regiments arriving and being fed into the defensive line as they reached the area, rather than the division fighting as a unified formation. It violated doctrinal preferences for keeping divisions concentrated, but doctrine assumed normal circumstances, and these circumstances had stopped being normal when 100,000 German artillery shells had announced the start of Hitler's last great offensive. Gavin understood that getting some forces there quickly was better than getting all forces there slowly, that every hour delayed was an hour German forces could use to advance, to encircle Bastogne, to cut the roads the Americans needed to reinforce and supply the garrison. By late afternoon, December 17th, lead elements of the 82nd were approaching Bastogne. They could hear artillery fire in the distance, see smoke rising from the horizon, feel the transition from movement toward combat to being actually in a combat zone where death became possible at any moment. The men made final preparations. checking weapons one last time, distributing ammunition in ways that made sense for imminent combat rather than transport, mentally preparing for the chaos they knew was coming. The officers studied maps and tried to understand a tactical situation that was still fluid, still developing, still fundamentally uncertain. Nobody knew exactly what they would find in Bastogne. Nobody knew whether they were arriving in time to reinforce a functioning defense or arriving too late to prevent disaster. The only certainty was that within hours, the 82nd Airborne would be in combat again, fighting in winter conditions against an enemy that had achieved total surprise and maintained momentum for more than 36 hours. The race to Bastogne was almost over. The real test was about to begin, and every man in the division understood that this battle would determine whether Hitler's gamble succeeded or failed, whether the Ardennes offensive became a strategic breakthrough or a final catastrophic failure that would hasten Germany's ultimate defeat. December the 17th, 1944, late afternoon. Bastogne, Belgium. Gavin's helicopter descended through sporadic German artillery fire toward the airfield on the outskirts of Bastogne, a landing that required more nerve than tactical wisdom, but which represented the fastest way to assess the situation personally rather than relying on radio reports that were fragmentary at best. From the air, Bastogne looked like every other small Belgian town, compact cluster of buildings surrounded by snow-covered fields and forest, church spire visible in the center, roads radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. But what made Bastogne critical wasn't the town itself. It was those roads, 7 major routes converging at a single point. Routes German armor needed to maintain momentum. Routes American forces needed to bring in supplies and reinforcements. The helicopter touched down hard, bouncing once before settling. Gavin climbed out before the rotors stopped spinning and moved immediately toward the command post, where General Anthony McAuliffe was attempting to organize the defense with forces that included the 101st Airborne Division, elements of several armored units that had retreated in good order, and now the arriving 82nd. The situation was desperate but not yet hopeless, a distinction that would prove critical in the hours ahead. McAuliffe's command tent was chaos organized by necessity. Maps covered every flat surface, showing German positions that were based more on estimation than confirmation because reconnaissance had been disrupted by weather and enemy action. Staff officers spoke simultaneously on multiple radios, trying to coordinate units that were arriving from different directions and needed to be integrated into a coherent defensive line. Casualty reports came in continuously. 50 men here, 30 men there, steady attrition that wasn't catastrophic in any single instance, but which accumulated into serious degradation of combat power. McAuliffe greeted Gavin with the blunt directness of a man who had no time for military courtesies. We're surrounded, or we will be within 24 hours. German armor is moving to cut all the roads. We've got 10,000 men from the 101st, whatever you brought from the 82nd, and fragments from other units. We're low on everything that matters: ammunition, medical supplies, food. The Germans know how valuable this place is, and they're going to hit us hard until we break, or until we're relieved. Gavin studied the maps and made the calculations commanders make when faced with desperate situations. How long could they hold with what they had? What would happen if German attacks succeeded in specific sectors? Where to position his arriving regiments to provide maximum defensive coverage? The tactical coordination between Gavin and McAuliffe established the framework that would define the defense of Bastogne. The 101st would hold the southern and western sectors, where German attacks were already developing. The 82nd would take the northern and northeastern sectors, the most likely avenues for German armor attempting to cut the last remaining roads into Bastogne before American forces could fully establish their defensive perimeter. This division of responsibility made sense both tactically and organizationally. It gave each division commander clear sectors of responsibility, prevented confusion about who controlled which units, and allowed both divisions to fight according to their training and doctrine. But it also meant the defense of Bastogne would succeed or fail, based on whether 2 separate airborne divisions, arriving piecemeal under extreme time pressure, could establish defensive positions strong enough to withstand concentrated assaults by German forces that outnumbered them and possessed significant armor support. The supply situation was worse than initial reports suggested. Bastogne had approximately 10 days of ammunition at current expenditure rates, which sounded adequate until you realized that defensive combat typically consumed ammunition much faster than pre-battle estimates suggested. They had 5 days of food, assuming 1 full meal per day per man, which meant immediate rationing and the certainty that defenders would be fighting on empty stomachs within a week if resupply didn't arrive. Medical supplies were critically short. 900 wounded Americans were already in Bastogne's makeshift aid stations, many requiring surgery or treatment that couldn't be provided with available resources. Every casualty added to this burden, every wounded man requiring care that medical personnel couldn't adequately provide, and creating impossible triage decisions about who received treatment and who received only morphine while they waited to die. The supply crisis meant the defense of Bastogne had a clock running independent of German tactical success. Even if American forces held every defensive position, they would eventually run out of the materials needed to continue fighting. German forces surrounding Bastogne represented approximately 40,000 men with substantial armor support, part of the 5th Panzer Army under Monteufel's command, and elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army that had been diverted south when the northern offensive encountered stronger resistance than expected. This was not a random collection of defeated units. These were veteran formations that had survived years of combat, reinforced with new equipment, all organized into a coordinated force capable of conducting complex combined arms operations. German commanders understood that taking Bastogne mattered less than neutralizing it, that even if they couldn't capture the town, they could isolate it, bypass it, continue their advance westward while leaving American forces trapped in a pocket that would eventually surrender through starvation and ammunition exhaustion. The encirclement of Bastogne was already nearly complete by the time Gavin arrived. Within 24 hours, it would be total. The question wasn't whether Bastogne would be surrounded. The question was whether surrounded American forces could hold long enough for relief forces to break through the German ring. December 22nd, 1944. A German officer arrived under a flag of truce with a message for the American commander. To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The message was typed on official German military stationery and signed by the German commander. It was delivered with the expectation that desperate men would choose survival over futile resistance, that Americans facing overwhelming odds would make the rational choice to surrender rather than die defending a small Belgian town that had no particular strategic value beyond its road network. The German officer waited patiently for the American response, perhaps already anticipating how the capture of 2 airborne divisions would be reported in German newspapers as proof that the offensive was succeeding, that American morale was cracking, that Hitler's gamble was paying off. McAuliffe's response became one of the defining moments of American military culture. Nuts. One word. No explanation, no elaborate defiance. Just a simple, profane rejection that communicated more clearly than any formal military response that the Americans had no intention of surrendering, that the Germans would have to take Bastogne by force if they wanted it, that despite being outnumbered and surrounded and running low on everything that sustained combat operations, the defenders would fight until they were relieved or destroyed. The German officer who received this response had to ask for clarification because nuts had no direct translation in German military terminology. An American officer explained in terms the German could understand. It meant, go to hell. The German officer departed, and the message went up through German command channels. The Americans at Bastogne would not surrender. They would have to be destroyed. And destroying 2 divisions of paratroopers who had already survived Sicily and Normandy and Holland was going to cost more than German commanders had anticipated when they issued their ultimatum. Gavin's tactical assessment focused on the northern and northeastern sectors, terrain that offered some natural defensive advantages but which was too extensive for the forces available to defend in depth. The forests northeast of Bastogne provided cover, but also concealment, that would allow German infantry to approach American positions without being detected until they were in assault range. The rolling hills north of town offered good fields of fire for defensive weapons, but also provided German armor with protected approach routes that would be difficult to interdict with the limited anti-tank assets available. Gavin positioned his arriving regiments carefully, accepting that the defensive line would be thin in places, planning for defense in depth where he could, and accepting calculated risks where he couldn't. The defense would succeed or fail based on whether individual companies and platoons could hold their positions against determined German attacks, face whether small units could function independently when higher headquarters lost contact, whether American paratroopers could prove that training and determination could overcome numerical disadvantage and the natural tactical advantages defenders usually enjoyed. By nightfall, December the 17th, the encirclement of Bastogne was essentially complete. American forces held the town, and a perimeter extending roughly 5 miles in each direction, surrounded by German forces that controlled everything beyond that perimeter. Supply convoys could no longer reach Bastogne by road. Communication with higher headquarters was limited to radio contact, that German jamming frequently disrupted. The garrison was truly isolated, dependent entirely on its own resources and whatever could be delivered by air if weather permitted. Inside the perimeter, all American soldiers prepared defensive positions in frozen ground, dug foxholes that would provide minimal protection against artillery, strung communication wire between positions that would probably be cut by the first German barrage, and tried to find ways to stay warm in temperatures that dropped below zero every night. The defense of Bastogne had begun not with dramatic combat, but with cold, exhaustion, and the growing realization that relief might be days away, and might not arrive at all if German forces succeeded in extending their breakthrough westward. The 82nd had arrived at the cauldron. Now they would discover whether they could survive what was coming, whether determination and training would prove sufficient against artillery and armor, and the grinding attrition of combat waged in winter conditions, where the cold killed as effectively as bullets. Whether paratroopers who had survived 3 combat jumps could survive a 4th battle that would be fought not from the sky, but from frozen foxholes against an enemy that had achieved surprise, momentum, and the temporary belief that final victory might still be possible. December 19th, 1944, 6 a.m. Northern perimeter, Bastogne. The first probe came as shadows moving through morning fog, German reconnaissance elements testing American defensive positions with the careful deliberation of professionals who understood that rushing into prepared defenses got you killed. And Sergeant Thomas Crawford watched through field glasses from his foxhole 300 yards behind the forward line, trying to count movement in the gray murk that made depth perception impossible and turned every bush into a potential enemy soldier. His platoon held 800 yards of the northern perimeter. 32 men responsible for terrain, that doctrine said, required at least 80 to defend adequately. They had dug in during the night, hacking through frozen earth that was as hard as concrete, creating shallow depressions that provided minimal cover against small arms fire and essentially no protection against artillery. Crawford had fought in Normandy and Holland. He knew what German infantry looked like when they were preparing for a serious assault versus when they were just testing defenses. What he saw through the fog looked like testing, but testing meant the real attack would come soon, probably within hours, and his undermanned platoon would have to hold or die trying because there were no reserves, no fallback positions. Nothing behind them except more Americans who were equally outnumbered and equally determined. The radio call from the forward observation post came at 6:15. "Sergeant, we've got movement at 300 yards. Germans in company strength, maybe more. Permission to fire?" Crawford made the calculation every infantry leader makes when facing this question. Fire too early, and you reveal your positions without inflicting significant casualties. Wait too long, and the enemy closes to assault range before you can establish effective fire superiority. He decided to wait, gambling that his forward observers could judge range accurately in fog that made everything uncertain. The Germans advanced in a loose formation that showed professional training, using cover, moving in rushes while other elements provided suppressing fire, coordinating their movement in ways that poorly trained infantry couldn't manage. At 200 yards, Crawford gave the order to fire. The American line erupted, every rifle and machine gun opening simultaneously, tracers cutting through fog like bright orange lines, connecting American positions to German soldiers who suddenly found themselves in a killing zone with minimal cover and nowhere to hide. German Stoogie 3 assault guns appeared behind the infantry, low-profile armored vehicles mounting 75mm guns that could destroy American positions with direct fire while being difficult targets for the limited anti-tank weapons the paratroopers possessed. The assault guns fired methodically, one round every 20 seconds, each shot aimed at suspected American positions, identified by muzzle flashes or radio antennas, or simply logical placement based on terrain analysis. A direct hit on Crawford's left flank position killed 3 men instantly and wounded 2 others who screamed for medics while Germans continued their advance. Crawford called for mortar support, giving coordinates that were approximate because precision wasn't possible when you couldn't see more than a few hundred yards. The mortar rounds started falling 30 seconds later, the 60mm high explosive shells that burst above ground and showered German infantry with shrapnel that killed some, wounded others, and forced the remainder to seek cover rather than continue advancing. The assault stalled 200 yards from the American line, German infantry pinned by mortar fire, while their assault guns tried to suppress American positions, but couldn't identify clear targets in the fog. Private James "Red" Johnson from Chapter 1 fired his M1 Garand with mechanical precision. 8-round clips, ejecting with a distinctive ping that every infantry soldier knew meant you needed to reload immediately before German soldiers used that brief vulnerability to advance. He had survived Normandy by learning to function in combat without thinking too much, and by letting training take over and muscle memory execute actions that conscious thought would slow down. He saw a German officer 50 yards away trying to organize his men for another assault. Red grabbed a rifle grenade from his equipment, affixed it to his Garand's muzzle, aimed high to account for the ballistic arc, and fired. The grenade fell short by 10 yards, but close enough that the explosion killed the officer and scattered the men he had been organizing. Red reloaded and continued firing at targets that appeared briefly in the fog and then disappeared, unable to confirm whether his shots hit or missed, just maintaining fire because that was what you did in defensive combat. You fired at anything that moved. You kept the enemy's heads down. You created enough chaos that their attacks couldn't develop momentum. The first day's fighting along the northern perimeter produced 47 American casualties, 11 killed, 31 wounded, 5 missing, and presumed captured when German forces overran an isolated observation post. German casualties were estimated at over 150. Actual body count was impossible because German forces recovered their dead during lulls in the fighting, but blood trails in the snow suggested that American fire had been effective, that the defense had held not through superior numbers, but through superior fields of fire, prepared positions, and the simple determination to shoot straight when men were trying to kill you. Crawford's platoon had held its 800 yards. Other platoons along the northern perimeter had similar experiences, probing attacks that developed into serious assaults, or defensive fire that disrupted those assaults, German withdrawals that left bodies in the snow but didn't break American positions. By nightfall December 19th, the line had held, but everyone understood that testing was finished. The real assault would come tomorrow or the next day, and then they would discover whether determination and accurate shooting would be sufficient against a coordinated attack by veteran German infantry supported by armor and artillery. American defensive positions reflected both doctrinal training and desperate improvisation. The primary fighting line consisted of foxholes spaced 15 to 20 yards apart, close enough for mutual support, but far enough that a single artillery shell couldn't destroy multiple positions. Behind the primary line, vast platoon and company command posts occupied slightly larger holes that provided room for radios and maps, and the minimal staff required to coordinate defensive fire. Behind those, mortar positions and ammunition dumps were positioned in defilade where possible, protected from direct fire, but vulnerable to artillery that could reach anything within range. The entire defensive network was connected by communications trenches that were really just paths through the snow marked with white engineer tape, providing routes for runners when radio communication failed, and for wounded men trying to reach aid stations without exposing themselves to German fire. Doctrine called for defensive positions to include overhead cover, reinforced fighting positions, interlocking fields of fire, carefully planned and rehearsed. Then reality gave them frozen foxholes, fields of fire limited by fog and forest, and coordination that depended on soldiers who could barely see positions 50 yards away, making instant decisions without guidance from higher command. Ammunition consumption during the first day's fighting revealed the mathematics of defensive combat. Crawford's 32-man platoon fired approximately 2,000 rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition, 60 mortar rounds, and used 8 rifle grenades. Scaled across the entire northern perimeter, the 82nd's defensive operations consumed roughly 50,000 rounds per day, and numbers that seemed sustainable when you had 10 days of ammunition, stockpiled until you realized that combat intensity varied unpredictably, and that German attacks might intensify rather than diminish as they became more desperate to achieve breakthrough. Gavin's staff calculated that at current burn rates, the division had enough ammunition for 8 to 10 more days of sustained defensive fighting. But if German attacks increased in intensity, if American forces had to repel multiple coordinated assaults per day rather than 1 or 2 probing attacks, that timeline could shrink to 5 or 6 days, and resupply depended entirely on weather that would allow transport aircraft to fly, on German anti-aircraft defenses not becoming too effective, on the airlift capacity that was already stretched thin, supporting operations across the entire theater. Temperature conditions added a dimension to the battle that had nothing to do with German tactics and everything to do with basic human survival. December nights in the Ardennes dropped to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin developed frostbite in minutes, cold enough that weapons required constant attention to prevent freezing, cold enough that men in foxholes faced a choice between staying alert and staying warm because you couldn't do both. Soldiers learned to rotate positions inside foxholes, one man on watch while another tried to generate body heat through isometric exercises that didn't require leaving the relative protection of their hole. They learned to keep rifle actions clean of moisture that would freeze solid and prevent the weapon from firing. They learned that wool was better than cotton, that multiple thin layers trapped more heat than single thick layers, that dry socks were worth more than hot food because trench foot could cripple you as effectively as a bullet. By December 24th, the 82nd would report 347 cold weather injuries, men whose feet or hands or faces had been damaged by exposure, reducing combat effectiveness without a single German shot being fired. The cold was an enemy that attacked constantly, that never retreated, that killed through exposure rather than violence. Casualty evacuation from forward positions to aid stations revealed the strain on medical resources. Wounded men were carried by stretcher through communications trenches or across open ground when trenches didn't exist, borne by soldiers who were already exhausted from fighting and digging and trying to stay warm, but who understood that leaving wounded men to die was unacceptable regardless of how difficult evacuation might be. The aid stations in Bastogne were overwhelmed, 900 wounded Americans by December 20th, arriving faster than medical personnel could treat them, requiring triage decisions about who received surgery, who received basic wound care, who received only morphine while they waited to see if they would survive. Surgeons operated in makeshift facilities that had been schools or churches before, becoming medical stations, working without adequate supplies, at making do with whatever they had, because the alternative was watching men die from wounds that proper facilities could have treated. The wounded kept arriving, head wounds, chest wounds, amputations, burns, trauma injuries that would challenge well-equipped hospitals, but which Bastogne's medical stations had to manage with minimal resources and constant awareness that German artillery could hit the aid stations themselves at any moment. By the evening of December 19th, the northern perimeter had survived its first serious test. German forces had probed the defenses, identified American positions, tested the strength and determination of defenders, and withdrawn to plan the next phase of assault. American forces had held their positions, inflicted significantly more casualties than they had received, and demonstrated that Bastogne would not fall easily regardless of German numerical superiority. But survival for one day didn't guarantee survival for the next. German commanders were analyzing the day's fighting, identifying weak points in American defenses, planning concentrated attacks that would commit armor and artillery to breakthrough operations rather than reconnaissance in force. The 82nd soldiers cleaned weapons, redistributed ammunition, tried to eat cold rations and get some sleep, while remaining alert for the artillery barrage that would signal the next German assault. Crawford stood in his foxhole during the brief twilight, before full darkness, and looked at the bodies still lying in the snow where German soldiers had fallen. Tomorrow, there would be more bodies. Some of them would be American, yet some would be his men. He had no illusions about holding indefinitely, but holding for one more day, surviving one more German assault, that seemed possible. That seemed like something his platoon could do. And if they could do it tomorrow, maybe they could do it the day after. Maybe they could hold long enough for relief forces to arrive, for the siege to end, for this desperate defense to transform into something other than a slow death in frozen foxholes. Maybe. The darkness came. The cold deepened. And somewhere in that darkness, German soldiers were preparing for the assault that would test whether American determination could withstand everything Germany's last great offensive could bring against them. December 20th, 1944. Afternoon. Eastern perimeter, Bastogne. The German Panzer IV column appeared through the tree line at 1400 hours, 12 tanks moving in a formation that showed professional training and tactical competence. Engines roaring with that distinctive sound that separated German armor from American, tracks chewing through snow that muffled their approach until they were close enough that defenders could see commanders in the turrets coordinating the advance. Corporal David Martinez watched through a gap in his foxhole's snow cover and felt his stomach drop. He was an anti-tank specialist, which meant he carried a bazooka and 3 rockets, responsible for destroying German armor with a weapon that was effective at 50 yards and mostly useless beyond 100. The tanks were currently at 400 yards and closing. And Martinez had destroyed a German half-track in Normandy and missed a Panther completely in Holland, 2 engagements that had taught him that anti-tank combat was less about heroism than about mathematics. Angle of approach, speed of target, range calculation, all performed while someone with a 75mm gun was trying to kill you. His sergeant had told him to wait until the tanks reached 50 yards before firing. Waiting felt like insanity, but firing too soon would waste the rockets without achieving kills, and wasting rockets meant German armor would drive straight through American positions. The tactical problem facing American defenders was brutally simple. They had infantry weapons and limited anti-tank capabilities against German armor that was designed specifically to destroy infantry positions. The 82nd's anti-tank assets in the eastern sector included 6 M1 A157mm anti-tank guns that could penetrate Panzer IV armor at close range, but which were difficult to conceal and vulnerable to artillery, and approximately 40 bazookas distributed among rifle companies with varying degrees of effectiveness depending on who was firing them and under what conditions. Against 12 Panzer IVs supported by infantry, this was inadequate firepower if the engagement became a straight shooting match. The defense would succeed only if American forces could use terrain advantage to create kill zones where German armor had to approach through predetermined firing lanes. If American soldiers could hold fire until German tanks were close enough that bazooka rockets would penetrate, if everyone executed perfectly under conditions that made perfection nearly impossible. Military doctrine called this defense in depth with integrated anti-tank fire. Reality called it desperation, organized by necessity. German armor doctrine in December 1944 represented the accumulated wisdom of 5 years of mechanized warfare fought across Europe, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. Tanks were breakthrough weapons, designed to penetrate defensive lines and then exploit into rear areas where they could destroy supply lines, command posts, and artillery positions. They worked best in open terrain where speed and firepower could be leveraged, worst in close terrain, where infantry with handheld anti-tank weapons could approach unseen and fire at minimum range. That the Ardennes in winter was emphatically not ideal tank country. Forests limited maneuver, snow concealed obstacles. American defensive positions were designed specifically to channel German armor into killing zones. But German commanders were committed to breaking the Bastogne perimeter, and breaking prepared infantry defenses required armor support. So the tanks came forward, crews knowing the risks, understanding that some of them would die, accepting that cost because the alternative was watching the offensive stall while American reinforcements arrived and German fuel supplies ran low, and the weather window closed and the entire operation collapsed into failure. Martinez's bazooka team included himself and a loader, Private Collins, whose job was to reload the weapon after each shot, and who was currently pressed against the back wall of their foxhole, trying to make himself as small as possible while armor approached. Collins was 19 years old and had been in combat for exactly 4 days. He had received bazooka training that consisted of firing 3 practice rounds at a stationary target and listening to a lecture about proper loading procedures. Now, he was expected to function under fire while German tanks advanced and German infantry swept the defensive line looking for targets. Martinez talked to him in the calm voice veterans used with replacements who were about to discover what combat actually meant. When I fire, you reload immediately. Don't think. Don't watch where the rocket goes. Just reload. If I'm hit, you take the bazooka and fire at the next tank. Aim for the side armor if possible. Front armor is too thick, understand? Collins nodded, unable to speak, and Martinez turned his attention back to the approaching armor. The first 57mm anti-tank gun opened fire at 300 yards. The sharp crack of its gun, distinctive among the sounds of battle. The round hit the lead Panzer IV on the front glacis and bounced off, ricocheting into the air in a shower of sparks that looked impressive but did no damage. The Panzer IV stopped, its turret traversing to acquire the gun position, and fired. The 75mm high explosive round hit directly on the anti-tank gun, killing the crew instantly and destroying the weapon. 5 anti-tank guns remained. 11 Panzer IVs continued advancing. Now the mathematics of the engagement were becoming very clear. American forces had traded 1 anti-tank gun for 0 German tanks, an exchange rate that could not be sustained. German infantry behind the tanks began suppressing suspected American positions with rifle and machine gun fire, not aimed at specific targets, but simply putting rounds downrange to make American defenders keep their heads down while armor closed the distance. At 100 yards, the Panzer IVs split formation, 3 tanks moving directly toward Martinez's position, while others distributed along the defensive line to engage American positions that were firing at them. This was good tactics. Concentrate force against a specific point rather than dispersing fire across the entire defensive front. It was also terrifying if you happened to be at the specific point being concentrated on. Martinez watched a Panzer IV grow larger in his sight picture, tracks throwing up snow, exhaust visible from the engine, every detail becoming sharp with the terrible clarity that combat provides when death is measured in yards rather than abstract possibilities. At 75 yards, he wanted to fire. At 60 yards, he wanted to fire. At 50 yards, his training took over. He aimed at the tank's side armor where the turret met the hull, the weakest point on a Panzer IV's profile. He fired. The rocket flew straight, no wind to deflect it, minimal drop at this range. It hit exactly where Martinez had aimed and penetrated. The internal explosion of a penetrated tank is one of warfare's most horrific ways to die. And the rocket creates a jet of superheated metal that burns through armor and continues into the crew compartment where it ignites ammunition, fuel, anything flammable. The crew of the Panzer IV had perhaps 2 seconds to register what happened before their tank became their tomb. Fire consuming the interior, while external ammunition exploded and blew the turret 20 feet into the air. The tank that had been advancing seconds earlier was now a funeral pyre, smoke pouring from every hatch, secondary explosions rocking the hull. Martinez didn't watch. He was already down in his foxhole while Collins loaded another rocket with hands that shook so badly it took 3 attempts to seat the rocket properly. German machine gun fire raked their position, rounds cracking overhead, all forcing them to stay down while other German tanks continued advancing toward American positions that were firing frantically at armor that kept coming forward despite losses. A 2nd Panzer IV died to a 57mm gun firing from defilade, the round penetrating side armor at an angle that allowed it to reach the ammunition storage. A 3rd took a bazooka rocket to its tracks, immobilizing it but not killing the crew, who continued firing their turret-mounted machine gun at American positions until a 2nd bazooka team put a rocket through the driver's vision port. German infantry, seeing 3 of their supporting tanks burning or disabled, lost momentum. The advance stalled. Officers tried to reorganize their men for another push, but American rifle fire was too intense, forcing Germans to find cover rather than continue attacking. The remaining German tanks withdrew, firing as they moved, covering the retreat of infantry that fell back in relatively good order, but with notably less confidence than they had shown during the advance. By 1500 hours, the eastern sector fighting had ended. 3 German tanks burned in no man's land between the lines. 40 German infantry lay dead or wounded in the snow. The American defensive line had held. American casualties in the eastern sector engagement included 17 killed and 39 wounded, losses that were sustainable in absolute terms, but which represented significant degradation when units were already under strength. 2 anti-tank guns had been destroyed, all reducing the division's anti-tank capability and forcing redistribution of remaining guns to cover wider sectors. Ammunition expenditure had been heavy. The engagement consumed 120 bazooka rockets, approximately 500 anti-tank gun rounds, and several thousand rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition. The defenders had won the engagement by conventional military metrics. They had held their positions, inflicted 3-to-1 casualty ratios, destroyed or disabled 3 enemy tanks for the loss of 2 anti-tank guns. But winning had come at a cost that accumulated, men killed who couldn't be replaced, ammunition expended that couldn't be easily resupplied, equipment destroyed that had no ready replacement. Defense was inherently attritional. The question wasn't whether the defenders could win individual engagements. The question was whether they could sustain winning long enough for relief forces to arrive. German armor tactics in the Bastogne fighting revealed a fundamental mismatch between German doctrine and the tactical reality they faced. Panzer formations were trained and equipped for breakthrough operations in open terrain, where their speed and firepower could be leveraged against defenders who couldn't concentrate sufficient anti-tank assets to stop them. The Ardennes in winter, with its forests and snow and prepared defensive positions, negated most of these advantages. Tanks couldn't maneuver freely when forests limited their movement to roads and trails. Speed mattered less when defenders were dug in and waiting rather than retreating in disorder. Its firepower was less decisive when targets were hidden in foxholes rather than exposed in the open. German tank commanders understood these limitations but had no alternative tactics to employ because the offensive required breakthrough, and breakthrough required armor, and armor had to be committed despite tactical disadvantages. The result was a series of engagement where German tanks achieved local successes but couldn't exploit those successes into operational breakthrough, where each advance cost tanks that couldn't be replaced and achieved gains that couldn't be sustained. Martinez sat in his foxhole after the engagement ended and tried to process what had happened. He had killed 5 men, the crew of the Panzer IV he had destroyed, men he had never met and would never know anything about, except that he had killed them with a weapon that weighed 13 pounds and cost approximately $100 to manufacture. Combat produced these moments of dissociation where the enormity of what you had done collided with the mundane reality that you were still alive, still in a foxhole, still responsible for doing it again if more German tanks appeared. Collins was vomiting in the corner of their position, overcome by adrenaline crash and fear and the reality of combat that training could never adequately prepare you for. Martinez let him finish and then made Collins drink water and check their remaining rockets. 2 left, enough for 1 more engagement if they were lucky, insufficient if German armor returned in force. All other soldiers along the defensive line were having similar experiences, processing combat, accounting for losses, redistributing ammunition, preparing for the next attack that might come in an hour or a day or never. This was warfare as it actually existed, rather than how it appeared in training films or news reports. brief moments of terrifying intensity separated by longer periods of cold and exhaustion and anticipation of what might come next. The eastern perimeter had held. German armor had been stopped. But everyone understood that stopped didn't mean defeated, that German commanders would analyze this engagement and plan the next assault differently. All that the defense would be tested again and again until either the defenders broke, or relief forces arrived, or ammunition ran out, or some other variable changed the fundamental equation of the siege. Martinez cleaned his bazooka and waited for whatever came next. December 19th, 1944. England. Captain Robert Hayes stood on the tarmac at an airfield in southern England and watched ground crews loading supplies into 241 C-47 transport aircraft, the largest supply drop operation mounted in the European theater and possibly the most dangerous. The mission was simple in concept and nearly suicidal in execution. Fly to Bastogne through winter weather and German-controlled airspace, descend to 800 feet above ground level to ensure accurate delivery, that drop supplies to the surrounded garrison, and return before German fighters or anti-aircraft artillery destroyed too many aircraft to make the operation sustainable. Hayes had flown transport operations since 1943, delivering paratroopers to Sicily and Normandy, evacuating wounded from forward airstrips, supplying isolated units. This would be his 47th combat mission. The cargo manifest for his aircraft listed ammunition, medical supplies, and concentrated rations. Total weight 4,800 pounds, distributed in bundles that would be pushed out the cargo door when they reached the drop zone. Weather forecasts predicted partial cloud cover with visibility reduced by snow. German anti-aircraft capabilities around Bastogne included 88mm flak guns that could reach aircraft at operational altitude, and 40mm Bofors that were deadly against low-flying transports. Expected casualty rate for the mission: 15 to 20% aircraft losses. Hayes had survived worse odds, but statistics provided cold comfort when you were about to fly into German guns. The supply crisis in Bastogne had reached critical levels by December 19th. Ammunition stockpiles that had seemed adequate for 10 days of defensive fighting were being consumed at rates that suggested perhaps 6 days remained before American forces would be shooting rifles without bullets. Food supplies were being rationed to 1 meal per day per man, portions that provided minimal calories for soldiers who were burning energy fighting and digging and trying to stay warm in sub-freezing temperatures. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted: morphine for pain management, sulfa powder for infection prevention, plasma for trauma cases, bandages for wounds, all running critically low, while wounded men continued arriving at aid stations that could provide comfort but not comprehensive treatment. The garrison could survive without adequate food for perhaps 2 weeks before starvation seriously degraded combat effectiveness. It could survive without adequate medical supplies, though casualties would die who might otherwise survive. It could not survive without ammunition. The mathematics were simple. No bullets meant no defense meant German breakthrough, and German breakthrough meant the siege ended in surrender or annihilation. Air resupply wasn't an option. It was the only option. Weather had closed Bastogne to air operations from December 20th through 22nd, 3 days when cloud cover extended from ground level to 10,000 feet, making flight impossible for transport aircraft that required visual navigation to find drop zones and deliver supplies accurately. Those 3 days consumed ammunition and supplies without replacement, drawing down stockpiles while German attacks continued, and American defenders fired thousands of rounds daily, keeping German forces away from their positions. By December 23rd, the weather finally cleared enough to permit flight operations. The forecast predicted a brief window, 12 to 18 hours of flyable weather before another storm system moved through. Every available transport aircraft in England was committed to the Bastogne supply mission, because this might be the only opportunity for days, because the garrison couldn't survive another 3-day period without resupply, because if this mission failed, the entire defense of Bastogne might collapse not from German tactical success, but from simple logistics failure. The C-47 transport aircraft were workhorses of Allied logistics, twin-engine planes designed for cargo and paratroop operations, capable of carrying approximately 6,000 pounds of supplies or 24 fully equipped soldiers, rugged enough to absorb substantial damage and still fly. They were not combat aircraft. They had no armor protection. They mounted no defensive weapons beyond small arms that crew members could fire from windows. Their cruising speed was 160 miles per hour, slow enough that German fighters could intercept easily, and anti-aircraft guns could track without difficulty. Their operational ceiling was 24,000 feet, but supply drops required descending to 800 feet to ensure bundles landed within the Bastogne perimeter, rather than scattering across German-held territory. At 800 feet, the aircraft were vulnerable to every German weapon larger than a rifle. Machine guns could penetrate their thin aluminum skin, 40mm cannon could blow them apart, 88mm flak guns could destroy them with near misses from fragmentation alone. If the pilots flying these missions understood, they were essentially flying into German anti-aircraft traps, with no way to fight back and limited ability to evade. They flew anyway because American soldiers on the ground needed what they were carrying. The formation took off at 0700 hours, aircraft lifting from English airfields in groups of 3, climbing to operational altitude, forming into a stream that stretched for miles across the Channel and over France. Hayes flew in the lead group, navigating by dead reckoning and radio beacons because weather still limited visibility to a few miles at best. The flight to Bastogne took 2 hours, time spent monitoring engine instruments, coordinating with other aircraft by radio, watching for German fighters that intelligence said were operating in the area, but which hadn't been spotted yet. The crew was quiet, each man focused on his specific responsibilities. Co-pilot monitoring flight controls, navigator checking course headings, loadmaster ensuring supplies were properly secured for dropping. Combat missions had a rhythm that experienced crews knew well: pre-flight tension as you prepared, operational focus as you executed the mission, and either relief when you survived or terror when something went wrong. Hayes had experienced both enough times that he maintained emotional distance from what they were doing, treating it as a technical problem to be solved, rather than a life-threatening situation to be feared. The approaches to Bastogne brought the first German anti-aircraft fire, and black puffs appeared in the sky ahead, 88mm flak bursting at altitudes where the fragments could shred aircraft fabric and puncture fuel tanks. The formations descended to 800 feet, losing the altitude advantage to improve delivery accuracy, immediately encountering 40mm fire that traced glowing paths through the air, and machine gun fire that sounded like hail hitting the fuselage. A C-47 200 yards ahead of Hayes took a direct hit, the aircraft exploding in midair, debris tumbling toward the ground, while the other aircraft maintained formation, because breaking formation meant losing the protection of concentrated defensive fire and the coordination required to deliver supplies to the correct drop zone. And Hayes pushed down the reflexive fear that came from watching men die and focused on the technical requirements: airspeed 120 miles per hour, altitude 800 feet, course heading 270 degrees toward the drop zone marked by colored panels that American troops had laid out in patterns visible from the air. The drop sequence required precision timing. Crew chief at the cargo door, watching for the drop zone signal. Loadmaster ready to release bundles. Pilot maintaining steady course and altitude, while anti-aircraft fire tried to knock the aircraft out of the sky. Hayes saw the colored panels and gave the signal. Bundles started tumbling out the door, parachutes deploying automatically, or floating toward the ground where American soldiers were already moving to collect them before German fire could destroy supplies that had cost men their lives to deliver. The drop lasted 45 seconds, time that felt like hours while the aircraft flew straight and level through anti-aircraft fire that couldn't be evaded without abandoning the mission. A round punched through the fuselage behind Hayes' seat, missing him by 2 feet, exiting through the roof and leaving a hole that whistled in the slipstream. The last bundle dropped. Hayes banked hard left and dove for the deck, using terrain to break German tracking, accelerating to maximum speed as the formation scattered and individual aircraft found their own routes back to England. The supply drop of December 23rd delivered 1,420 tons to Bastogne, enough ammunition for 2 days of sustained combat, enough food for 4 days at current rationing levels, enough medical supplies to treat the wounded who were currently waiting for care. The cost was 32 transport aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair, 154 aircrew killed or captured, the largest single-day transport loss in the European theater. The casualty rate exceeded pre-mission estimates, but the mission succeeded in its primary objective. The Bastogne garrison had supplies sufficient to continue fighting. German forces would not force American surrender through starvation or ammunition exhaustion. The defense would continue until either German attack succeeded or relief forces broke through the encirclement. The transport crews who survived returned to England, landed, and prepared for the next mission that would come when weather permitted and when Bastogne's supplies ran low again. There was no celebration. There was only the grim understanding that they had kept American soldiers alive for another few days, and would probably have to do it again soon. Ground perspective of the supply drop revealed chaos transformed into organization through desperate necessity. American soldiers in Bastogne watched aircraft approaching through anti-aircraft fire, saw bundles falling, ran through snow to collect supplies before German artillery could hit the drop zone. Some parachutes failed. Some bundles landed outside the perimeter in German-held territory. Some supplies were destroyed by German fire before they could be collected. But most reached American hands, were carried to distribution points, were issued to units that desperately needed what they contained. Ammunition was distributed first, then medical supplies, then food. Soldiers opened crates that had been loaded in England hours earlier and found bullets that would keep them alive, bandages that would save wounded men, rations that would prevent starvation. The sky had delivered salvation, purchased with the lives of air crews who had flown into hell to keep ground forces fighting. The defenders of Bastogne understood the price that had been paid on their behalf. They honored that price by continuing to fight, by holding positions against German attacks, by refusing to surrender despite being surrounded and outnumbered, and facing an enemy that kept coming forward despite losses that should have broken their will. By nightfall, December 23rd, Bastogne had been resupplied but not relieved. German forces still surrounded the town. American forces still held a perimeter that was too extended for adequate defense and too important to abandon. The supply drop had bought time, perhaps 3 or 4 days before another drop would be needed, perhaps longer if German attacks decreased in intensity, or American ammunition consumption declined. But time was a temporary resource. Eventually, weather would close again and prevent air operations. Eventually, German anti-aircraft defenses would become effective enough that supply drops became unsustainable. Eventually, some variable would shift and transform Bastogne from a siege that could be endured into a siege that could not. The garrison understood this. They fought anyway. They held their positions anyway. They survived one more day anyway, because that was what soldiers did when surrounded. They fought until relieved or destroyed. They held their ground because orders said hold, and training said obey, and culture said that Americans didn't surrender easily, regardless of odds. The sky had provided for them. Now they would provide for themselves through determination and accurate shooting, and the stubborn refusal to die that separated units that broke under pressure from units that absorbed everything the enemy could deliver and kept functioning. Bastogne would hold. The question was simply, how much longer, at what cost, and whether relief would arrive before the variables shifted and made continued resistance impossible. December 22nd, 1944. German High Command, Western Front. Yes, Field Marshal Walter Model studied the operational maps in his headquarters and confronted a reality that Hitler refused to accept. The Ardennes offensive had failed. Not failed in the sense of suffering tactical defeats, though those had occurred. Not failed in the sense of achieving no gains, though gains had been more limited than planned. Failed in the fundamental sense that the strategic objectives, splitting Allied armies, capturing Antwerp, forcing a negotiated settlement, were now impossible to achieve with available forces in the remaining time window before American reinforcements sealed the breakthrough. The maps told the story in colored pins and situation markers. German spearheads had advanced 20 miles in the northern sector, less in the south. Bastogne had not fallen despite 5 days of siege. American forces that should have panicked and retreated had instead stood in place and fought. German fuel supplies, already inadequate at the start of operations, were now critically low. The weather window that had protected German armor from Allied air attack was closing, and American intelligence had detected German panzer formations moving north toward the Ardennes, suggesting reinforcements on a scale that would overwhelm German offensive capacity. Model was a professional soldier who understood military mathematics. The arithmetic of this offensive no longer worked. They had failed. The only question was whether Hitler would recognize reality or continue the operation until German forces collapsed completely. December 22nd brought intelligence that transformed German calculations. American Third Army under General George Patton was turning north, reorienting from offensive operations in Lorraine to counterattack operations in the Ardennes. The reports from German reconnaissance indicated approximately 6 divisions moving at maximum speed, covering approximately 15 miles per day over roads that were clogged with military traffic and partially blocked by winter weather. Simple mathematics suggested Patton's forces would reach the Bastogne area within 4 days, possibly sooner if American logistics proved as effective as it usually did. This transformed the operational situation completely. German forces besieging Bastogne were now themselves threatened with encirclement. American forces inside the pocket, American reinforcements arriving from the south, American forces in other sectors preparing counterattacks that would compress the German salient from multiple directions. The offensive that was supposed to split Allied armies was itself in danger of being split, cut off, destroyed. German commanders who had planned for exploitation warfare now faced defensive warfare against an enemy that possessed material superiority and operational momentum. A Wehrmacht general's diary, discovered after the war, captured the despair that professional officers felt but could not openly express. December 22nd, the offensive has failed. We can still fight. We can still delay the Americans. But we cannot win. And every day we continue this operation consumes men and equipment that we will need desperately when the Americans and British launch their spring offensive. We are sacrificing our last reserves for a plan that never had realistic chances of success. History will judge harshly. The entry was written in careful script, the handwriting of an educated man who understood that he was participating in a catastrophic failure but who lacked the authority or courage to stop it. German military culture emphasized obedience even when orders were tactically or strategically unsound. Officers who disagreed with Hitler's decisions could voice concerns privately, but were expected to execute orders regardless of personal assessment. The result was an army that functioned efficiently at tactical levels while pursuing strategic objectives that rational analysis suggested were unattainable. Hitler's response to reports of American reinforcements revealed the disconnect between political leadership and military reality. He ordered German forces to continue the offensive, to maintain pressure on Bastogne, to push for breakthrough regardless of mounting evidence that breakthrough was no longer possible. Some historians would later characterize this as madness. Others would describe it as desperation born from understanding that Germany had no good options, that defensive warfare would lead to slow defeat, while offensive warfare at least offered the possibility of disrupting Allied plans. Hitler's calculus was political as much as military. A negotiated settlement with the Western Allies required demonstrating that Germany could still conduct effective offensive operations, that the Wehrmacht remained a force capable of inflicting casualties and achieving objectives. That unconditional surrender was not Germany's only option. The Ardennes offensive had not achieved its strategic goals, but perhaps continuing the operation would achieve the secondary goal of killing enough Americans to make Allied publics question whether total victory was worth the cost. It was a thin hope, but it was the only hope Hitler had left. German supply crisis reached critical levels by December 24th. Like fuel reserves that had been calculated to support operations for 10 days were nearly exhausted after 8 days, because combat consumption always exceeded planning estimates and because American tactical aircraft had begun interdicting German supply columns once weather cleared. Ammunition stockpiles that should have been sufficient for the entire operation were running low because artillery expenditure during the initial breakthrough had been enormous, and because resupply through damaged transportation networks was proving slower than planned. Food supplies were adequate, but required distribution networks that American air attacks were disrupting. The logistical situation meant German units were fighting at reduced combat effectiveness, armor operations limited by fuel shortages, artillery support reduced by ammunition constraints, and infantry subsisting on reduced rations while conducting operations in winter weather that increased caloric requirements. Logistics was revealing what tactical fighting had not yet demonstrated conclusively. Germany lacked the material resources to sustain offensive operations against an enemy that possessed overwhelming industrial capacity and secure supply lines. December the 24th brought the order that acknowledged reality without explicitly admitting failure. German forces besieging Bastogne were to transition from assault operations to siege operations. They would maintain positions around the American perimeter, but would not conduct major attacks designed to achieve breakthrough. Artillery would continue firing to prevent American forces from relaxing, but infantry and armor would be conserved for defensive operations that would become necessary when American relief forces arrived. The order was tactically sensible. Why waste forces assaulting a position that could be contained while German strength was applied elsewhere? Strategically, it was an admission that Bastogne would not fall, that American forces inside the pocket had held long enough to force German commanders to abandon attempts at capturing the town through direct assault. For the 82nd and 101st Airborne divisions holding Bastogne's perimeter, the December 24th order wouldn't be known immediately. They would only experience its effects, German attacks becoming less frequent, artillery fire continuing but armor assaults ceasing, the siege continuing but its intensity declining. Relief was coming. They just needed to survive a few more days. Gavin received intelligence about Patton's relief force through radio communications that had been intermittent throughout the siege, but which were improving as American signal units established better communications networks. The message was simple: hold for 48 hours. Relief is approaching from the south. Be prepared to transition from defense to offense once link-up occurs. 48 hours, 2 days. The garrison had ammunition for perhaps 4 days of sustained combat, food for 3 days at current rationing, medical supplies sufficient to treat casualties if casualty rates didn't increase dramatically. 48 hours was achievable. Surviving 2 more days was possible. The defenders had endured 8 days surrounded, had repelled German attacks, and had maintained unit cohesion despite casualties in cold and the constant pressure of siege warfare. 2 more days seemed manageable. The psychological impact of knowing relief was approaching transformed the garrison's morale. Men who had been fighting with grim determination now fought with cautious optimism. Unit commanders who had been calculating how long their supplies would last now calculated how they would coordinate with relief forces. Staff officers who had been planning final defensive positions now planned offensive operations. German attrition rates by December 24th revealed the cost of 8 days of offensive operations. Approximately 60,000 German casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Tank losses exceeded 400 vehicles, some destroyed in combat, and others abandoned when fuel ran out, or mechanical failures occurred far from repair facilities. Artillery ammunition expenditure had consumed stockpiles that should have lasted weeks. Infantry replacements were not arriving because Germany's manpower reserves were nearly exhausted, leaving battalions understrength and forcing German commanders to consolidate units rather than maintain full organizational structure. The offensive had cost Germany more than it could afford to lose, casualties that would have been acceptable if strategic objectives had been achieved, but which represented catastrophic waste when the offensive failed to split Allied armies or capture Antwerp or force negotiated settlement. But the German commanders conducting after-action assessments would conclude that the Ardennes offensive had been Germany's last significant military asset, gambled on an operation that never had realistic chances of success. A desperate throw of the dice that had come up short and left Germany with nothing remaining to stop the inevitable Allied advance into the Reich. Strategic geography by December 24th showed the limits of German achievement. The deepest German penetrations had reached approximately 20 miles beyond the initial front lines. creating a bulge in Allied positions that gave the campaign its popular name, but which had not achieved breakthrough into Allied rear areas. The Meuse River, which German planners had designated as the first-day objective for lead elements, remained 65 miles from the deepest German spearheads. Antwerp, the ultimate objective that would have split Allied armies and disrupted logistics, was 100 miles away and protected by multiple American and British divisions that were now moving to contain the German advance. The offensive had created tactical complications for Allied operations, but had not achieved strategic disruption. It had killed approximately 19,000 Americans and wounded 47,000 more, substantial casualties that represented the largest American losses in any single campaign during the European War. But American replacement systems were functioning. Reinforcements were arriving from the United States. Industrial production continued at rates that Germany could not match. The casualty exchange ratio favored neither side decisively enough to change the fundamental strategic balance. Germany was still losing the war. The Ardennes offensive had simply made that losing process more expensive in blood for everyone involved. Model looked at the maps one final time and prepared the situation reports that would go to Berlin. The reports would be honest about German positions and tactically accurate about current operations. They would not state explicitly what Model believed to be true, that the offensive had failed, that relief of Bastogne was imminent, that German forces would soon be fighting defensively rather than offensively, and that Hitler's last great gamble had achieved nothing except consuming the reserves that Germany would desperately need when Allied forces launched their spring offensive and pushed into Germany itself. The war continued, but for Germany, the Ardennes offensive marked the transition from hoping for military miracles to simply trying to survive the final destruction of the Reich. December 26, 1944, 4:47 p.m. Southern approach to Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his Sherman tank, watching the road ahead for German defensive positions that intelligence said were somewhere between his column and Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, had been driving north for 4 days, fighting through German rearguards, yet bypassing strong points when possible and reducing them with concentrated fire when bypass wasn't an option. Patton's orders had been characteristically direct. Get to Bastogne, break the siege, do it fast. Abrams had commanded armor long enough to understand that fast in winter combat meant accepting risks that peacetime doctrine would never tolerate. That speed sometimes mattered more than security, that losing a few tanks to German anti-tank guns was acceptable if the alternative was arriving too late to matter. His column had lost 6 Shermans in 4 days to German fire, mines, and mechanical breakdowns. They were approximately 2 miles from Bastogne. Intelligence reported German forces between his position and the town were light, possibly just rearguards preparing to withdraw. Abrams didn't trust intelligence reports that described enemy forces as light because light had a way of becoming heavy once fighting started. But orders were orders. The column continued north. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, soldiers heard American tank engines before they saw the tanks themselves. The sound was distinctive, the higher-pitched roar of American radial engines different from the lower rumble of German diesels, familiar enough that veterans could identify American armor by sound alone. Word spread through defensive positions faster than radio communication could have transmitted it. American tanks were approaching from the south. Relief was here. The siege was ending. Men who had been fighting for 8 days with minimal food and constant cold allowed themselves to hope that survival was now more likely than death. Indeed, that they would live to see January, that the desperate defense had actually worked. Some soldiers cried, others laughed. A few simply sat in their foxholes and tried to process the realization that they had endured, that relief forces had arrived, that the improbable defense of an obscure Belgian town had succeeded despite being surrounded and outnumbered and facing an enemy that should have overwhelmed them through sheer material superiority. The link-up between Abrams's column and Bastogne's defenders occurred without dramatic fanfare. Tanks stopped, infantry emerged from foxholes, officers exchanged situation reports and coordinated next actions. The professional business of war continued because relief didn't mean the fighting was finished, only that the immediate crisis had passed. German forces were withdrawing, but not defeated. If American forces needed to expand the corridor connecting Bastogne to friendly lines, needed to bring in supplies and reinforcements, needed to transition from defensive operations to offensive operations that would push German forces back and eliminate the threat to the town permanently. Gavin met with Abrams and other relief force commanders to coordinate the next phase. The 82nd would maintain defensive positions on the northern perimeter, while 4th Armored Division expanded the corridor southward. Additional American divisions would attack into the German-held territory to compress the Bulge and cut off German forces that remained committed to forward positions. The statistics of survival told the story of what the garrison had endured. The 82nd Airborne had suffered 376 killed in action during the Bastogne siege, men who had died holding defensive positions, operating anti-tank weapons, coordinating artillery fire, conducting patrols, doing the 1,000 dangerous tasks that defensive combat required. 1,914 wounded, injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to catastrophic trauma that required immediate evacuation and surgery. Approximately 200 missing, men who had been captured when positions were overrun, killed in circumstances where bodies couldn't be recovered, or simply lost in the confusion of combat where record-keeping became impossible. Total Bastogne garrison casualties from all American units exceeded 3,000 for 8 days of siege warfare, and German casualties in attacks on the Bastogne perimeter exceeded 8,000 killed and wounded, testament to the effectiveness of American defensive fire and the high cost of assaulting prepared positions, even when attackers possessed numerical superiority. German withdrawal from the Bastogne perimeter began gradually on December 26th, units pulling back to new defensive lines rather than attempting to hold positions that were now untenable with American relief forces arriving in strength. The withdrawal was professionally executed, rear guards covering the movement of main forces, artillery providing suppressing fire to prevent American pursuit, engineers destroying bridges and blocking roads to delay American advance. German commanders understood they had failed to take Bastogne and now needed to preserve whatever forces they could for defensive operations that would determine whether German armies in the West could maintain a coherent defensive line or whether Allied forces would achieve complete breakthrough. The withdrawal transformed the tactical situation completely. American forces that had been besieged defenders now became part of a larger counteroffensive, the siege that had defined their experience for 8 days, now becoming just one phase of a larger campaign that would continue through January as American forces pushed German armies back to starting positions and beyond. Within 24 hours of link-up, American reinforcements flooded into Bastogne, 20,000 additional troops from multiple divisions, now armor assets that transformed the garrison from infantry-heavy to combined arms-capable, artillery that provided fire support for offensive operations, logistics units that established supply lines to sustain operations without dependence on airdrops. The transformation of Bastogne from besieged garrison to offensive staging area happened with remarkable speed because American logistics systems functioned efficiently even when operating under combat conditions. Trucks carrying ammunition and supplies rolled through the southern corridor that 4th Armored had opened. Engineers repaired roads that German artillery had damaged. Medical units established proper facilities to treat the wounded who had been subsisting on minimal care in improvised aid stations. The American capacity to mobilize resources and apply them rapidly to changing tactical situations represented a significant advantage over German forces that were struggling with supply lines that had been interdicted and logistics systems that were collapsing under pressure of sustained operations. The 82nd Strength on December 26th stood at approximately 9,000 combat-effective troops, down from the 11,500 who had deployed to Bastogne. The casualties had reduced every regiment's strength, forced consolidation of companies that were too understrength to operate effectively, eliminated experienced leaders who couldn't be replaced with personnel of equal capability. But the division remained combat effective, capable of offensive operations, all still functioning as a coherent organization, despite losses that would have broken less well-trained units. The paratrooper culture of the 82nd emphasized adaptability, independent operations by small units, confidence that came from surviving multiple combat jumps and ground campaigns. These cultural factors transformed statistical losses into manageable degradation rather than catastrophic collapse. Units absorbed replacements, trained them quickly in essential skills, incorporated them into existing teams with efficiency that came from having done this before in Sicily and Normandy and Holland. Private Johnson stood in his foxhole on the northern perimeter and watched supply trucks rolling into Bastogne from the south. 8 days earlier, he had been writing letters home and hoping the war might be finished soon. Now he was a siege veteran with a combat infantry badge, a Purple Heart for a shrapnel wound that had been minor enough to treat in place, and the knowledge that he had survived something that would define the rest of his life. He didn't feel heroic. He felt exhausted, cold, and grateful to be alive when so many men he had known were dead. The truck convoy represented more than supplies. It represented the return of normality after 8 days of abnormality, the restoration of connection to the larger American force after 8 days of isolation, the confirmation that the desperate stand had mattered enough that the Army had committed substantial resources to relief operations. Johnson pulled his jacket tighter against the cold and waited for whatever came next. The siege was over, but the war continued. Yeah, and he would continue with it, because that was what soldiers did. They survived one crisis and then prepared for the next, until eventually the war ended, or they died trying to see it through to conclusion. Gavin's after-action assessment would later characterize the Bastogne defense as successful because it achieved its primary objective, preventing German forces from using the road network to exploit their breakthrough westward. The defense had cost 376 82nd Airborne soldiers killed and nearly 2,000 wounded. It had consumed enormous amounts of ammunition and supplies. It had required supply drops that cost transport crews significant casualties. But it had held. German forces had not captured Bastogne. They had not opened the roads they needed for exploitation. They had been forced to transition from offensive to defensive operations without achieving strategic objectives. The siege had succeeded in military terms. Whether that success justified the cost in human lives was a question Gavin would struggle with for the rest of his life, a question every commander faces when tactical victory comes at the price of men under their command. The relief had arrived, the defenders had survived, the strategic situation was shifting in American favor, and somewhere in the frozen forests around Bastogne, the bodies of American and German soldiers lay in the snow, all testament to the price both sides had paid. For a campaign that would be remembered as Germany's last great offensive and America's desperate successful defense against an enemy that had achieved complete surprise and nearly won before determination and logistics and simple stubborn courage had turned the tide. December 27th, 1944. Dawn, Northern Sector, Bastogne. Major Robert Cole stood in the snow, studying a map of terrain his battalion would attack within the hour. Terrain that had been German-held for 8 days, and would now become contested ground as American forces transitioned from defense to offense. The 82nd Airborne's 3rd Battalion had spent the siege holding defensive positions on the northern perimeter, repelling German probes and assaults, and watching men die in foxholes that had become graves. Now they would advance, moving north toward villages with unpronounceable Belgian names, clearing German rear guards from forests and farmland, reclaiming ground that German forces had taken during their initial breakthrough. Cole had commanded infantry in 3 campaigns before this. He understood that attacking was different from defending, that soldiers who had survived by staying in foxholes now had to move across open ground where German artillery could find them, where German machine guns could cut them down, where the advantage shifted from defenders who knew every inch of their terrain to attackers who were advancing into uncertainty. His men were exhausted from 8 days of siege warfare. They were under strength from casualties. They were about to discover whether determination that had sustained them through defensive combat would carry them through offensive operations against an enemy that was withdrawing but not defeated. The attack began with artillery preparation, American guns that had been positioned during the siege now firing on German positions identified by reconnaissance patrols and aerial observation. 155mm howitzers and 105mm guns hammered suspected German strongpoints, attempting to suppress defensive fire and destroy positions before American infantry advanced. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, shorter than doctrine recommended, but adequate for immediate tactical requirements given that German forces were withdrawing rather than preparing extended defense. At 0700 hours, the artillery lifted and infantry moved forward in the company columns, advancing through snow that was knee-deep in places and frozen hard in others, moving through forests where visibility was limited and where German rear guards could be waiting behind any tree line. The advance was methodical rather than rapid, squads moving by bounds with covering fire, platoons coordinating movement to maintain cohesion, companies staying in radio contact with battalion headquarters that tracked progress and adjusted supporting fire as needed. German resistance materialized 200 yards into the advance when a well-camouflaged machine gun position opened fire on the lead platoon. The American advance halted instantly, men dropping into whatever cover existed, returning fire at muzzle flashes that were difficult to pinpoint in the forest. Cole called for mortar support, giving approximate coordinates because precision wasn't possible when you couldn't see the target clearly. 60mm mortar rounds started falling 30 seconds later, walking across the suspected German position until one round landed close enough that the machine gun fire stopped. The advance continued. 300 yards further, another German position, this time a platoon-sized force defending a small village, firing from windows and doorways, forcing American forces to clear buildings individually in close quarters. Combat that was slow and dangerous and costly. By mid-morning, Cole's battalion had advanced less than a mile, and clearing 3 villages and eliminating approximately 40 German soldiers who had stayed behind to delay the American advance while their units withdrew to new positions. A soldier being wounded during the advance experienced a different calculus than casualties during defensive operations. In defense, wounded men could be evacuated from foxholes to aid stations with relative safety because evacuation routes were known and protected. In offense, wounded men fell in exposed positions where retrieving them meant additional soldiers exposing themselves to fire. Private Marcus Williams watched a man from his platoon take a bullet through the leg during a firefight in a village street, saw him fall and try to crawl to cover while German fire continued from a building 50 yards away. Williams and another soldier ran forward under covering fire from their squad, grabbed the wounded man under his arms, and dragged him to a doorway while bullets cracked past close enough to feel the shock waves. The wounded man was screaming, not from pain alone, but from fear and shock and the realization that he might die here in a Belgian village whose name he didn't know, fighting for ground that seemed to have no particular importance, except that someone had decided it needed to be taken. Williams applied a pressure bandage to the leg wound, gave the man morphine from his aid kit, and left him in the doorway for medics to collect, while the attack continued, because stopping meant losing momentum, and losing momentum meant giving Germans time to establish better defensive positions. Yet German delaying tactics revealed professional competence despite strategic failure. Rearguard forces didn't attempt to hold positions indefinitely against superior American forces. They fired until American forces brought overwhelming firepower to bear, then withdrew to the next defensive position where the process repeated. They destroyed bridges that American engineers would have to repair before vehicles could advance. They blocked roads with felled trees that required time to clear. They mined likely approach routes with whatever explosives they had available. Every delay cost time, and time allowed German main forces to establish new defensive lines further east, to regroup units that had been scattered during the offensive, to consolidate forces for the defensive operations that would determine whether German armies could maintain coherent resistance, or whether American forces would achieve complete breakthrough into Germany itself. The German soldiers executing these delays understood they were buying time with their lives, that staying behind to fight rearguard actions meant risking capture or death, that the strategic situation was hopeless, but that professional duty required continuing to fight until ordered to surrender, or until no alternative remained. By December 31st, the 82nd had advanced approximately 23 miles north from Bastogne, recapturing villages and farmland that had been German-held since December 16th, pushing the front line back toward positions that had existed before the offensive began. In the advance cost 312 killed, men who died clearing villages, who stepped on mines, who were hit by artillery fire that German forces called in on American advance routes, who were killed in the 1,000 ways that offensive combat produced casualties, 1,847 wounded, injuries that ranged from minor to catastrophic, men evacuated to aid stations that were now properly equipped rather than the improvised facilities that had existed during the siege. The casualty rate during the offensive phase was actually higher than during the defensive phase, confirming what military historians had documented across centuries of warfare. Attacking is more costly than defending when both sides are competently led and adequately equipped. Enemy terrain conditions neutralized many American advantages that had been decisive in earlier campaigns. Deep snow prevented rapid movement that had characterized American advances across France in August and September. Frozen roads limited mechanized support that American forces usually leveraged to achieve superior mobility. Limited visibility from winter weather reduced the effectiveness of American air superiority, preventing close air support missions that would have suppressed German defensive positions and interdicted German supply lines. The Ardennes in winter was infantry country, where success depended on small unit leadership, individual soldier skill with basic weapons, and the ability to function in conditions that were as hostile to human life as combat itself. American technological advantages in armor, artillery, and air power still mattered, but mattered less than they would have in summer conditions with clear weather and dry ground. The campaign became a test of which army could sustain operations longer under conditions that degraded everyone's combat effectiveness and sustainability, depended more on logistics and replacement systems than on tactical brilliance. German equipment losses during the withdrawal became visible to American forces advancing through areas where German forces had been positioned. Abandoned tanks that had run out of fuel and been destroyed by their crews rather than left intact for American recovery. Artillery pieces that had been spiked when ammunition ran out, and German forces lacked the vehicles to tow them during withdrawal. In trucks and half-tracks that had broken down and been stripped of useful parts before being left behind. The material losses told the story of German logistics failure. They had advanced farther than their supply lines could support, consumed fuel faster than replacement deliveries could provide, fought longer than their ammunition stockpiles could sustain. American forces recovering this equipment sent intelligence reports documenting the scale of German losses, information that confirmed what operational analysis suggested. Germany's last great offensive had consumed the mobile reserves that would have been needed to defend against Allied spring offensives, leaving German forces critically weakened at the moment when Allied industrial advantage was producing replacement equipment and personnel at rates Germany could not match. And an American reinforcement flow during late December exceeded 40,000 troops per week arriving from the United States and England, replacements who were distributed to units that had suffered casualties during the Ardennes campaign. The 82nd received approximately 3,000 replacements during January. New soldiers who had completed basic training but lacked combat experience, men who needed to be integrated into existing squads and platoons, and taught the practical skills that separated survivors from casualties. Veteran soldiers who had survived the siege found themselves teaching replacements, lessons learned through experience, how to dig proper foxholes in frozen ground, how to identify German weapon sounds by audio signature, how to move under fire without panicking, how to function on minimal sleep and inadequate food while maintaining combat effectiveness. The replacement integration process was never perfect. Some replacements learned quickly and became effective soldiers. Others struggled and became casualties before gaining sufficient experience to survive. But the process functioned well enough that American units maintained combat effectiveness despite continuous casualties, while German units suffered similar casualties without adequate replacement flows and gradually degraded toward ineffectiveness. Cole's battalion established defensive positions on December 31st in a village they had captured after 6 hours of close quarters fighting that left 15 Americans dead and 40 wounded. The village was strategically insignificant, a cluster of farm buildings surrounding a church, a population perhaps 300, before the war evacuated most civilians to safer areas. But the village sat astride a road that connected German defensive positions, and roads mattered in winter warfare, where movement off roads became nearly impossible in deep snow. Holding the village meant controlling the road. Controlling the road meant German forces would have difficulty coordinating defensive operations in this sector. So, American soldiers who were exhausted from 4 days of continuous offensive operations dug new foxholes, established defensive positions, and prepared to hold ground. They had taken because holding was as important as taking, because every yard of Belgian territory reclaimed from German control represented progress toward ending the war, or toward the day when they could finally go home and try to rebuild lives that had been interrupted by years of combat. Cole walked the perimeter checking positions, talking briefly with soldiers who looked at him with the exhausted trust that combat soldiers give to officers who have led them through multiple engagements and kept them alive when death was the more likely outcome. He didn't give inspirational speeches. He simply confirmed that defensive positions were adequate, that ammunition was distributed, that wounded had been evacuated, that the administrative details of warfare were functioning. Tomorrow they would advance again. More villages would need to be cleared. More Germans would resist and then withdraw. More Americans would die, taking ground that might or might not be strategically significant, but which needed to be taken because orders said advance, and advancing was what infantry did, regardless of whether individual soldiers understood the strategic rationale. The exploitation phase continued. The 82nd advanced, and behind them, stretching back to Bastogne and beyond, a trail of frozen foxholes and burned-out vehicles and hastily marked graves documented the price American forces were paying to push German armies back toward the Reich, and the final battles that would end the war in Europe. December 19th, 1944. SHAF headquarters, Versailles, France. That's General Dwight Eisenhower stood before a wall-size map of Western Europe, dotted with unit markers representing the largest concentration of military force ever assembled on a single front. Over 600,000 American troops, 80,000 British troops, and facing them, approximately 130,000 German soldiers committed to Hitler's last desperate offensive. The map showed the Ardennes bulge in stark visual terms. A German salient protruding 40 miles into Allied lines, threatening to split American forces and disrupt the entire operational plan that was supposed to push into Germany and end the war by spring. Eisenhower's command style emphasized coordination over personal heroics, logistics over dramatic gestures, the unglamorous work of ensuring that 3 million Allied soldiers in Western Europe had the supplies, reinforcements, and coordination they needed to function as a unified force rather than a collection of competing national armies. The Ardennes crisis tested that coordination in ways that normal offensive operations never had. German breakthrough had surprised everyone. Now the question was whether Allied response could be swift enough and powerful enough to not just contain the German offensive, but destroy it, transforming Hitler's gamble into a catastrophic loss that would shorten the war rather than prolonging it. The strategic response Eisenhower ordered on December 19th consisted of 3 coordinated elements that would compress the German salient from multiple directions simultaneously. The 1st Army under General Courtney Hodges would hold the northern shoulder of the Bulge, preventing German forces from expanding their breakthrough northward toward key supply depots and communication nodes. 3rd Army under General George Patton would pivot from offensive operations in Lorraine and drive north toward Bastogne, relieving the garrison and attacking into the southern flank of the German salient. British and American forces in reserve would prepare to attack the western tip of the German advance, stopping German armor before it could reach the Meuse River and exploit into Allied rear areas. The plan required coordinating movements of multiple army groups, redirecting logistics flows that had been supporting operations across a 500-mile front, almost shifting ammunition and fuel priorities to support counteroffensive operations rather than the broad advance that had been planned before the German attack. It was precisely the kind of large-scale operational coordination that defined modern warfare, where success depended less on battlefield heroics than on staff work and logistics, and the unglamorous competence that kept vast military organizations functioning under extreme pressure. The decision to place Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in temporary command of American forces on the northern sector, became one of the war's most controversial command arrangements. Eisenhower made the decision based on practical considerations. Montgomery commanded British forces that were positioned to support operations on the northern shoulder. Communication lines ran through British-controlled areas. Awe and temporary unity of command would simplify coordination during the crisis phase. American generals, particularly Patton and Omar Bradley, viewed the decision as a betrayal and an insult to American command competence. Montgomery's subsequent public comments, suggesting that British intervention had saved American forces from disaster, poisoned Allied command relationships, and created tensions that would persist through the end of the war. The controversy revealed the complexity of coalition warfare, where national pride and inter-service rivalries could complicate operational decisions, where the best military solution might not be the best political solution. In a where Eisenhower's role required balancing military effectiveness against the political reality that American public opinion would not tolerate British commanders claiming credit for American battlefield success. Strategic timeline calculations showed that time favored the Allies more than the Germans despite German initial successes. American industrial production was generating approximately 1,000 tanks per month, 3,000 trucks per week, ammunition at rates that exceeded consumption even during intensive combat operations. German production had declined to approximately 500 tanks per month, constrained by raw material shortages, strategic bombing disruption, and the loss of industrial facilities in occupied territories. Its American replacement pipelines were delivering 40,000 trained soldiers per week to European theater, enough to replace casualties and expand existing units. German replacement systems were scraping together whatever manpower remained. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth, older men from Volkssturm units, convalescent soldiers returning to duty before fully recovered. Every week the war continued, shifted the balance more decisively in Allied favor, because American capacity to replace losses exceeded German capacity by margins that made prolonged warfare unsustainable for Germany. German commanders understood this arithmetic. They had gambled on achieving decisive breakthrough before American advantages could be brought to bear. They had failed. Now they faced the consequences of fighting an attritional war against an enemy that could afford attrition indefinitely. Logistics officer perspective revealed the extraordinary challenge of supporting over 1 million American troops conducting offensive operations in winter conditions. Daily ammunition consumption during intensive combat operations exceeded 4,000 tons, requiring continuous rail and truck delivery from ports in France to forward supply dumps. Food requirements exceeded 2,000 tons daily, though combat conditions often prevented hot meals from reaching frontline units that subsisted on cold rations and whatever they could forage. Fuel consumption for vehicles exceeded 1 million gallons daily, necessitating dedicated pipelines and tanker truck convoys that were themselves vulnerable to German air attack when weather permitted Luftwaffe operations. Medical supplies, winter clothing, replacement parts for vehicles and weapons all required dedicated logistics systems that functioned despite winter weather that closed roads, despite German artillery that interdicted supply routes, despite the simple friction of trying to deliver material to units that were constantly moving, and whose exact positions weren't always known to rear area supply personnel. The logistics achievement of sustaining American counteroffensive operations in the Ardennes represented organizational competence that was less dramatic than battlefield combat, but equally essential to operational success. The broader counteroffensive strategy aimed not just to restore the front lines, but to destroy German forces that had been committed to the offensive. Eisenhower's guidance to subordinate commanders emphasized that restoring territorial boundaries was secondary to inflicting maximum casualties on German forces that could not be easily replaced. The goal was a pincer movement, Third Army attacking from the south, First Army attacking from the east, British and American forces attacking from the west, compressing German forces in the salient until they either withdrew in disorder or were encircled and destroyed. Achieving this required coordination among multiple armies, precise timing to ensure pincer arms closed simultaneously, and enough combat power to prevent German forces from conducting fighting withdrawal that would allow them to escape encirclement. The operational complexity rivaled the Normandy invasion in its requirement for coordination across multiple command echelons, multiple national armies, and operational areas that spanned hundreds of miles. German forces by late December numbered approximately 200,000 in the salient, but with significantly degraded combat effectiveness from casualties, fuel shortages, and ammunition constraints. Intelligence estimates suggested German tank strength had been reduced by half through combat losses and mechanical breakdowns, that artillery fire had decreased because ammunition supplies were critically low, and that infantry units were under strength and exhausted from continuous combat without adequate rest. German command structure remained functional, but was struggling with communications difficulties as Allied tactical aircraft interdicted German radio relay stations and cut telephone lines. The German position was becoming untenable, unable to advance further because of fuel and ammunition shortages, unable to defend effectively because American counterattacks were compressing the salient from multiple directions, unable to withdraw easily because roads were congested and Allied air power could attack columns that moved during daylight. German commanders faced an impossible situation where all available options were bad, and the only question was whether German forces would be destroyed in place or allowed to conduct fighting withdrawal that would preserve some strength for defensive operations closer to the German border. Production capacity comparison between American and German war economies revealed why prolonged warfare guaranteed Allied victory. American factories were producing the material equivalent of what Germany produced while operating at approximately 60% capacity, suggesting that American production could increase if necessary, while German production was already at maximum sustainable levels. American worker productivity was higher because American factories weren't being bombed, because American workers were adequately fed and housed, all because American industrial infrastructure remained intact, while German infrastructure was being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. The economic foundation of the war was decisively in Allied favor, and the economic advantage translated into military advantages that accumulated over time: more tanks, more trucks, more aircraft, more ammunition, more of everything that modern warfare required. Germany had gambled on achieving decision through superior operational art and tactical excellence. That gamble had failed. Now, Germany faced a war of attrition that economic fundamentals made unwinnable. Strategic calculations by American commanders suggested the war in Europe would conclude by summer 1945, 6 months away. Though few soldiers on the ground believed the timeline was realistic, because their experience suggested wars lasted longer than planners predicted, and that German resistance would intensify as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself. The Ardennes offensive had disrupted the timeline by forcing Allied armies to redirect resources to defensive operations, rather than maintaining offensive momentum. But the disruption was temporary. German forces had consumed their last significant reserves, attempting to achieve breakthrough. Once the Ardennes situation stabilized, Allied forces would resume the broad advance into Germany with numerical and material superiority that German forces could not match. The question wasn't whether Germany would be defeated. The question was how many more soldiers would die before that inevitable conclusion was reached, whether German resistance would collapse quickly or continue until Allied forces occupied every inch of German territory, whether the war would end in negotiated surrender or unconditional capitulation imposed after Berlin fell. Eisenhower studied the maps and calculated the logistical requirements for spring offensives that would push Allied armies across the Rhine and into Germany's industrial heartland. The Ardennes had been a crisis, but crises passed, and when this crisis passed, American forces would resume the advance that would end the war in Europe. The 82nd Airborne's defense of Bastogne was one piece of a much larger strategic picture. Now, one contribution among thousands to the collective effort that would eventually produce victory. Gavin's paratroopers didn't need to understand the strategic picture. They just needed to hold their positions, advance when ordered, fight effectively in the tactical situations they faced. The strategic coordination was Eisenhower's responsibility. The tactical execution was theirs. And both levels were functioning well enough that the German offensive was being contained and would soon be reversed, transformed from German breakthrough into German catastrophe through the application of superior resources applied with adequate competence across an entire theater of operations. January 1st, 1945, Morning Report, C Company, 1st Battalion, 82nd Airborne. The company clerk typed the daily strength report with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. 15 men present for duty, 24 total on the roster when you counted the men who were technically assigned to the company, but who were sick with pneumonia, recovering from frostbite, hospitalized with wounds that might or might not heal sufficiently to return them to combat. C Company's authorized strength was 190 men organized into 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. Current reality was a single understrength platoon, commanded by a sergeant, because all the officers were casualties, and a replacement lieutenant was supposedly arriving from the rear echelon, but hadn't appeared yet. Thus, the numbers told a story that was replicated across the division. Continuous combat since mid-December had consumed unit strength through casualties and disease faster than the replacement system could restore it, leaving companies that existed on paper but barely functioned as combat-effective organizations, battalions that were commanded by captains who should have been commanding companies, squads led by privates because all the NCOs were dead or wounded. The 82nd was still fighting, still advancing, still executing operational orders, but the human cost of sustained winter combat was transforming the division into a collection of exhausted survivors held together by training and unit cohesion and the stubborn refusal to quit that separated elite units from those that broke under pressure. Medic Thomas Anderson had treated 217 casualties since December 17th, a personal record that he tracked not from pride, but from the need to quantify something that felt overwhelming and incomprehensible. He treated gunshot wounds and shrapnel wounds and burns from white phosphorus grenades. He treated frostbite cases where toes and fingers had frozen solid and required amputation that Anderson performed with a surgical saw in a foxhole because evacuating the patient would have exposed them both to German fire. He treated trench foot, a disease caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions that rotted flesh and disabled soldiers as effectively as bullets. He treated dysentery from drinking contaminated water and pneumonia from sleeping in frozen foxholes and combat fatigue from psychological stress that manifested as physical symptoms indistinguishable from illness. Anderson had learned that diseases killed as many men as combat in winter warfare, that maintaining basic hygiene was nearly impossible under field conditions, that preventing cold weather injuries required constant vigilance that exhausted men couldn't always maintain. The medical statistics were brutal. Approximately 20% of 82nd casualties during January were non-combat injuries, men whose bodies had failed under conditions that exceeded human tolerances even when they avoided being shot. A young replacement soldier arrived at the front line on January 2nd with equipment so clean it marked him as someone who had never been in combat. Private David Henderson was 19 years old, had completed basic training at Fort Benning 3 months earlier, had shipped to Europe with a replacement battalion that was supposed to bring depleted units back to full strength. He was assigned to what remained of C Company and given 15 minutes of orientation by Sergeant Crawford before being sent to a foxhole where he would spend his first night in combat, sleeping next to men who looked like they had aged decades in weeks. Henderson asked questions that veterans found simultaneously annoying and poignant. How often did Germans attack? What did you do when artillery started falling? How did you stay warm at night? Any questions that revealed he understood nothing about what he had been thrown into. Crawford answered patiently because he remembered being new once, remembered asking similar questions, remembered other veterans who had taken time to teach him things that training never covered. By dawn January 3rd, Henderson would understand more, because experience was a brutal but effective teacher. And if he survived long enough, he would become the veteran answering questions for the next group of replacements who arrived equally unprepared for the reality they were entering. Village fighting during early January became the characteristic tactical experience for infantry advancing through the Ardennes. Methodical clearing of buildings, room-by-room searches for Germans who might be waiting with grenades or machine guns, and careful movement through streets where every window could hide a sniper. The fighting was close and personal, Combat at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. Killing that happened face to face rather than at the anonymous distances that artillery provided. Soldiers learned that grenades were more useful than rifles and building clearing, that moving quickly was safer than moving carefully, because hesitation gave defenders time to react, that checking bodies was essential, because Germans who appeared dead sometimes weren't. By January 3rd, the 82nd had cleared approximately 30 villages during the exploitation phase, each village costing casualties, each village requiring the same dangerous procedures that couldn't be simplified or made safe. Or each village leaving psychological scars on soldiers who found that killing at close range was different from killing at distance, more visceral, more personal, harder to forget when you closed your eyes at night. Soldier mail arrived irregularly, delayed by winter weather and operational movement that made it difficult for postal units to locate recipient units that were constantly advancing. When mail did arrive, it was distributed with a ceremony that briefly transformed exhausted soldiers into men who remembered they had lives outside the combat zone, families who were waiting for them, futures that extended beyond the next firefight. Private Johnson received a letter from his mother, dated December 10th, written before the Ardennes offensive began, all asking again whether he would be home for Christmas, and including a photograph of his younger sister, who had gotten married while he was overseas. Johnson studied the photograph and tried to remember what normal life felt like, what it meant to worry about things like wedding planning and holiday dinners rather than whether you would survive the next German artillery barrage. Other soldiers read letters that conveyed news about births and deaths and job changes and the mundane progression of life that continued in America while they were fighting in Belgium. Some letters were cheerful, relatives writing about victory being near and the war ending soon. Sentiments that seemed absurdly optimistic from a frozen foxhole where the war felt eternal and victory felt uncertain. The letters were treasured anyway because they represented connection to something beyond combat, proof that a world existed where people weren't trying to kill you. Newspapers that reached frontline units reported "victory near" in headlines that contrasted sharply with the reality soldiers experienced daily. The disconnect between official narratives and ground truth became a source of bitter humor among troops who were advancing a few miles per week at substantial cost, while newspapers described the German army as defeated and demoralized. The Germans they were fighting didn't seem defeated. They seemed professional, determined, and perfectly capable of killing Americans who made tactical mistakes. The newspapers talked about rapid advances and collapsing German resistance. The reality was grinding attrition warfare where every village had to be taken through small unit combat, where German rearguards fought effectively even when outnumbered, where progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Soldiers learned to ignore the newspapers, to focus on their immediate tactical reality rather than the strategic narratives that bore little resemblance to their experience. Victory might be nearby, some strategic definition. But from a foxhole where you were cold and hungry and watching for Germans who were trying to kill you, victory felt very distant indeed. Non-combat casualty rates during January revealed the harsh reality of winter warfare. Medical records documented that approximately 20% of 82nd casualties were cold weather injuries or disease rather than combat wounds. Their frostbite disabled men whose feet or hands had frozen during overnight temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. Trench foot crippled soldiers whose feet had been wet for days, in boots that were designed for temperate climates rather than winter operations. Pneumonia hospitalized men whose resistance had been weakened by exhaustion and inadequate nutrition and constant exposure to cold. The Army's official medical guidance recommended rotating troops out of frontline positions every 72 hours to prevent cold weather injuries. Operational reality meant men stayed in positions for weeks because there weren't enough troops to maintain rotational schedules while conducting offensive operations. The result was a steady drain of combat effectiveness through injuries and diseases that weren't caused by German action, but which removed soldiers from combat as surely as bullets did. Combat fatigue cases represented the psychological cost of sustained operations under extreme stress. 85 men from the 82nd were hospitalized during January for what the medical establishment called combat fatigue or battle exhaustion, psychological conditions that manifested as inability to function effectively in combat situations. Symptoms included uncontrollable shaking, inability to sleep, panic reactions to normal combat stimuli, dissociation from immediate surroundings. The condition was poorly understood by medical personnel who had limited training in psychological trauma. Treatment usually consisted of sedation, net rest in rear area hospitals, and hope that time away from combat would allow soldiers to recover sufficiently to return to duty. Some recovered, others didn't. The Army's official position was that combat fatigue represented temporary breakdown rather than permanent disability, that most soldiers could return to duty after adequate rest. The reality was more complex. Some men never recovered fully. Some returned to combat, but functioned at reduced effectiveness. The psychological cost of war was real and substantial, but in January 1945, the medical and military establishments lacked the conceptual framework to address it adequately. PTSD wouldn't be formally recognized as a diagnosis for another 3 decades. Soldiers experiencing psychological trauma were told to be strong, to overcome weakness, to return to duty because the war required everyone who could fight. Ammunition consumption during the exploitation phase exceeded planning estimates because combat intensity varied unpredictably, and because American doctrine emphasized using firepower to suppress enemy positions rather than exposing infantry to unnecessary risk. Rifle companies fired an average of 2,000 rounds daily during active combat operations, though some days saw consumption spike to 5,000 rounds when companies encountered strong German resistance. Mortar sections expended their basic load within hours when supporting major attacks, requiring emergency resupply that strained logistics systems already operating near capacity. Machine gun ammunition consumption exceeded 10,000 rounds per gun during intensive firefights. Artillery batteries fired their daily allocation of shells in sustained fire missions, and then had to ration remaining ammunition for emergency missions. The logistics of keeping American units supplied with adequate ammunition was a continuous challenge that required truck convoys running constantly between forward supply dumps and frontline units, convoys that were themselves vulnerable to German artillery, and that sometimes arrived to find the units they were supposed to supply had already moved forward to new positions. Food and supply situation improved significantly after Bastogne was relieved, but distribution remained problematic because combat operations made regular meal schedules impossible. Hot food was supposed to be delivered daily from field kitchens in the rear echelon. And reality was that many units received hot meals 2 or 3 times per week when operational tempo permitted, subsisting otherwise on K rations and C rations that provided adequate calories but minimal variety, and which had to be eaten cold because heating them risked revealing positions to German observers. The rations were universally despised: meat and bean hash that congealed into paste when cold, crackers that were hard enough to break teeth, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from dirt. Soldiers supplemented official rations with whatever they could find: eggs from abandoned farms, vegetables from root cellars, occasionally chickens that had somehow survived in the combat zones. The improvised foraging was officially discouraged, but tacitly accepted, because maintaining morale required allowing soldiers whatever small comforts they could find, and fresh food was a luxury that mattered more than regulations about appropriating civilian property in combat zones. By mid-January, the 82nd's combat effectiveness had been degraded to approximately 60% of authorized strength, measured not just in personnel numbers, but in the accumulated exhaustion, equipment wear, and psychological strain that define sustained combat operations. Companies that should have had 190 men fielded 80. Battalions that should have had 800 fielded 400. The division remained combat effective, capable of executing operational orders, still functioning as a coherent organization. But the degradation was real and measurable and concerning to commanders who understood that combat effectiveness declined non-linearly as casualties accumulated, that a unit at 60% strength wasn't 60% as effective, but perhaps 40%. As effective because key leaders were casualties, specialized skills were lost, unit cohesion was disrupted. The replacement system was functioning, but replacements required time to integrate and training to be effective. And time and training were luxuries that frontline units conducting active operations couldn't provide adequately. The grinding attrition of winter combat was consuming the 82nd's strength. The question was whether the division would reach its operational objectives before its strength declined below the threshold where it could function effectively as a combat organization. The answer to that question would determine whether the 82nd's contribution to ending the Ardennes campaign was successful, or whether the division would need to be pulled from the line for reconstitution before it could continue operations. January continued, the cold continued, the fighting continued, and slowly, inexorably, the grinding attrition of winter combat continued consuming the strength of soldiers who had already survived more combat than most humans could endure, who kept fighting because that was their duty and their training, and because quitting wasn't an option, regardless of how difficult continuation became. It's January 14th, 1945. German Field Headquarters, Ardennes Sector. Captain Klaus Hoffmann read the situation report from his battalion commander and understood that his unit was no longer fighting to win, but simply fighting to survive. The report documented what every German officer in the salient already knew. Ammunition was critically short. Fuel was nearly exhausted. Replacements were not arriving. Casualty rates exceeded 50% in some companies. And the strategic situation was hopeless. Hoffmann's company had entered the offensive with 120 men. Current strength was 47, and half of those were walking wounded, who should have been evacuated but remained with the unit because there was nowhere to evacuate them to, and because every man who could still hold a rifle was needed for the fighting withdrawals that were consuming what remained of German combat strength in the West. The official orders still spoke of holding positions and conducting orderly defense. The reality was a slow-motion collapse where German units withdrew when American pressure became too intense, tried to establish new defensive positions, held briefly until American artillery and infantry attacks forced another withdrawal. The cycle repeated daily, each repetition consuming men and equipment that couldn't be replaced, or each withdrawal bringing German forces closer to the Reich border, and the final defensive battles that would determine whether Germany's defeat would be slow or catastrophic. German casualty rates from mid-December through mid-January exceeded 188,000, killed, wounded, or captured, losses that represented approximately 90% of the forces initially committed to the Ardennes offensive. Some units had been virtually destroyed, reduced to fragments that were absorbed by other formations. Others maintained nominal organizational structure, but functioned at combat effectiveness that was a fraction of authorized strength. The replacement system that was supposed to restore unit strength had collapsed under the strain of simultaneous losses on the Eastern Front, in Italy, and in the West. Or teenage soldiers arrived from training units with 6 weeks of preparation instead of the 4 months that pre-war training had provided. Older men from Volkssturm units arrived with minimal training and weapons that were obsolete. Wounded soldiers returned to duty before fully recovering because German doctrine required every man who could fight to be in the line regardless of physical condition. The quality of German forces was declining as precipitously as the quantity, creating a force that maintained professional appearance but functioned with significantly reduced effectiveness. German equipment losses during the campaign exceeded 1,400 tanks and assault guns, losses that represented approximately 70% of German armor strength on the Western Front. Some tanks were destroyed in combat, and others were abandoned when fuel ran out and crews couldn't obtain resupply. Still others suffered mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired because spare parts were unavailable and recovery vehicles couldn't reach disabled tanks in combat zones. American forces advancing through the Ardennes documented extensive German equipment graveyards, fields full of disabled tanks, roads lined with burned-out trucks, forests containing artillery pieces that had been destroyed in place when German forces withdrew without vehicles to tow them. The material losses exceeded what German industry could replace in months. Tank production was running at approximately 500 vehicles monthly, but production was declining as Allied strategic bombing destroyed factories and disrupted supply chains that provided raw materials and components. The German armored force that had terrified Europe in 1940 was being destroyed through attrition that couldn't be reversed through production or captured equipment or improvisation. A German captain's post-war testimony captured the despair that frontline officers felt but couldn't express openly during operations. We had no ammunition beyond what we carried. We had no fuel for our vehicles beyond what remained in their tanks. We had no hope of victory, or even of prolonged resistance. We were simply delaying the inevitable, trading German lives for a few additional days before American forces reached German territory. Every morning, I wondered whether my men would survive another day. Every evening I counted casualties and knew that tomorrow would be worse because we had fewer men and less ammunition, and American pressure continued to increase. We fought because we were soldiers, and soldiers fight when ordered, but nobody believed we were accomplishing anything beyond dying slowly instead of surrendering immediately. The testimony was given to American intelligence officers after the captain surrendered in late January. Similar testimonies from hundreds of captured German officers documented the collapse of morale and the realization that the Ardennes offensive had failed catastrophically. Fuel situation by mid-January had reached crisis levels that made sustained German operations impossible. German armored and mechanized units were rationed to 15% of normal fuel consumption, in allocations that barely permitted defensive repositioning and made offensive operations impossible. Fuel deliveries from the Reich were being interdicted by Allied tactical aircraft that attacked anything moving on roads during daylight hours. Storage facilities were being destroyed by strategic bombing that targeted oil refineries and fuel depots. The remaining fuel was being prioritized for operations on the Eastern Front, where Soviet armies were advancing toward German territory, and where the strategic threat was more immediate than in the West. German commanders in the Ardennes were told to conserve fuel, to use vehicles only when absolutely necessary, to rely on horses and human transport for logistics. The fuel shortage transformed German forces from mobile mechanized armies into essentially static defensive formations that could hold positions but couldn't maneuver, couldn't concentrate forces for counterattacks, couldn't execute the operational art that had defined Wehrmacht effectiveness earlier in the war. Ammunition situation paralleled the fuel crisis. German forces had consumed stockpiles during the initial breakthrough phase and now lacked adequate resupply to sustain defensive operations. Artillery batteries were rationed to 3 rounds per gun per day, allocations that permitted minimal fire support rather than the concentrated barrages that effective defensive operations required. Infantry ammunition was adequate for normal combat, but insufficient for the sustained firefights that occurred when American forces attacked prepared positions with overwhelming force. German soldiers learned to conserve ammunition, to fire single shots instead of bursts, to rely on grenades in close combat rather than suppressive fire that consumed bullets faster than supply could replace them. The ammunition shortages forced tactical adaptations that reduced German combat effectiveness. Attacks were launched with minimal artillery preparation because shells weren't available. Defensive positions were held, with minimal supporting fire because ammunition couldn't be wasted. Withdrawals happened earlier than tactically optimal because units couldn't sustain prolonged combat with available ammunition levels. A January 15th brought the order that acknowledged what German commanders had known for weeks: cease offensive operations, transition to fighting withdrawal, preserve forces for defense of the Reich. The order was phrased in terms that maintained military fiction of orderly operations, but the reality was permission to retreat, to abandon the Ardennes Bulge, to withdraw back across German borders and prepare for the defensive battles that would determine whether Germany could maintain organized resistance or whether the final collapse would be swift and total. German units began withdrawing immediately, conducting rearguard actions to cover the movement of artillery and vehicles, destroying bridges to delay American pursuit, mining roads to slow American advance. The withdrawal was reasonably well executed given limited fuel and ammunition, testament to professional competence of German staff officers and unit commanders who understood how to conduct difficult operations even when strategic position was hopeless. But execution didn't change the fundamental reality. Germany was retreating. The Ardennes offensive had failed completely, and the last mobile reserves that might have delayed Allied advance into Germany had been consumed in an operation that achieved nothing it had intended to achieve. American forces pursuing the German withdrawal found evidence of organizational collapse that statistics alone couldn't capture, supply dumps that had been abandoned intact because German forces lacked vehicles to move supplies during withdrawal. If field hospitals where wounded German soldiers had been left behind with minimal medical care because evacuation wasn't possible. Stragglers walking in small groups trying to reach German lines, surrendering without resistance because continuing to fight made no sense when the campaign was obviously lost. The physical evidence documented that German forces weren't conducting orderly tactical withdrawal, but were fragmenting under pressure, that organizational cohesion was breaking down, that the Wehrmacht on the Western Front was approaching the point where it would cease functioning as a coherent military force and would become a collection of isolated units fighting independent battles without coordination or strategic purpose. In American intelligence officers analyzing captured documents and interrogating prisoners reached the conclusion that German combat effectiveness had declined to perhaps 30% of pre-offensive levels, that current casualty rates were unsustainable, that complete German collapse in the West was possible within months if Allied pressure continued at current intensity. German strategic result of the Ardennes offensive could be measured in simple mathematics. They had committed their last significant mobile reserve, approximately 200,000 men with 1,400 tanks and 3,000 guns, to an operation that consumed those forces without achieving strategic objectives. The offensive was supposed to split Allied armies, disrupt Allied logistics, force negotiated settlement that would allow Germany to concentrate against the Soviet threat in the East. Instead, it had consumed German strength, demonstrated that German forces couldn't achieve breakthrough even when achieving complete surprise, and created conditions where Allied spring offensives would face significantly reduced German resistance because the forces that should have been defending the Rhine had been destroyed in the Ardennes. Military historians would later debate whether Hitler had any better alternatives, whether defensive strategy might have prolonged German resistance more effectively than the offensive gamble. But in January 1945, such debates were academic. Germany had gambled, Germany had lost. And even now, Germany would face the consequences of committing irreplaceable forces to an operation that had failed catastrophically. The breaking point had been reached. German forces were withdrawing, and somewhere in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the last phase of the campaign was beginning, the American pursuit that would push German forces back across the border and set conditions for the final battles that would end the war in Europe. The collapse was happening. The only question was how quickly, at what final cost, and whether Germany would attempt to negotiate surrender or would fight to the last man defending the ruins of the Third Reich. January continued. The war continued. And the inevitability of German defeat became more apparent with each passing day, as the forces that might have prevented that defeat were consumed in fighting that accomplished nothing except hastening the end that Hitler's gamble had been designed to prevent. January 25, 1945. Link-up point, Eastern Ardennes. The handshake between Major General James Gavin and Brigadier General Thomas Hickey symbolized more than a meeting of commanders. It represented the closing of a military noose that had been tightening around German forces in the Ardennes for 10 days. The junction of First Army forces attacking from the east and Third Army forces pushing from the south. The completion of a pincer movement that trapped approximately 100,000 German soldiers in a rapidly shrinking pocket with no realistic possibility of escape. The two generals stood in snow 3 feet deep, surrounded by staff officers and soldiers who understood they were witnessing a significant operational success, though most were too exhausted to celebrate. Behind them stretched the routes their respective forces had taken to reach this point. Miles of frozen roads, dozens of cleared villages, hundreds of German prisoners already being marched to rear area collection points, and the bodies of American soldiers who had died achieving the link-up. Military operations produced moments like this where strategic success could be marked by simple gestures, where commanders could acknowledge that complex plans had been executed successfully, despite friction and confusion, and the enemy's stubborn resistance. Then the moment passed, and the unglamorous work of consolidating gains and dealing with thousands of prisoners and planning the next phase of operations resumed. German surrender came in fragments rather than as a single organized capitulation. A lieutenant colonel commanding the remnants of 3 battalions approached American lines under a white flag and negotiated surrender for 10,000 men who lacked ammunition, food, and any means of continuing resistance. A captain leading 50 soldiers simply walked into an American position and asked to be taken prisoner because fighting made no sense when encirclement was complete. And individual German soldiers abandoned their weapons and surrendered to American patrols, motivated by hunger, exhaustion, and the realization that continued resistance would only prolong suffering without changing the inevitable outcome. By January 28th, approximately 100,000 German soldiers had been captured or had surrendered, removing an entire army group from German order of battle and creating a prisoner processing challenge that strained Allied logistics systems designed to handle thousands of prisoners, not tens of thousands arriving simultaneously. American forces discovering the scale of German equipment losses found material evidence of logistical collapse. 300 additional tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned during the final withdrawal, some disabled by mechanical failure, and others simply out of fuel and left behind when German crews retreated on foot. Artillery pieces by the hundreds spiked and left in position because German forces lacked the vehicles to tow them. Trucks and half-tracks and staff cars scattered along every withdrawal route, abandoned when fuel ran out or when American tactical aircraft caught them in the open. Supply dumps that had been intended to sustain German operations, but which had been overrun before German forces could utilize them. The material losses represented not just equipment destroyed, but production capacity that Germany could never replace. Industrial resources diverted to weapons that had been captured or destroyed before they could contribute to German combat effectiveness. American intelligence officers calculating total German losses during the Ardennes campaign estimated that Germany had lost the equipment equivalent of approximately 12 divisions, combat power that would have been needed desperately when Allied spring offensives resumed and pushed toward the Rhine. A German soldier's perspective on surrender, documented through prisoner interrogations, revealed the mixture of relief and shame that characterized German defeat. We knew we had lost weeks before we surrendered. Every day we fought was simply another day of dying for nothing. When the order finally came to surrender, I felt relieved that the killing would stop, ashamed that I was giving up, confused about what would happen to us as prisoners. I had fought for 5 years, since Poland in 1939. I had survived Russia and France and now Belgium, and it ended with walking into American lines and handing over my weapon because there was no point in fighting anymore. I don't know if history will remember us as brave soldiers who fought against impossible odds, or as fools who wasted our lives for a regime that led Germany to disaster. I know that I survived when many of my comrades didn't, and I don't know if that makes me lucky or cursed. The interrogation notes documented that the soldier was 24 years old, had been wounded 3 times, and was suffering from malnutrition and frostbite when he surrendered. The 82nd's final strength estimate on January 25th showed the cost of 6 weeks of sustained combat, approximately 5,000 combat-effective soldiers remaining from the 11,500 who had deployed to Bastogne in mid-December. Casualties included 1,038 killed in action, men whose names would be added to memorial lists and whose families would receive telegrams expressing the nation's gratitude for their sacrifice. 4,922 wounded, injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic. Some men who would return to duty after recovery, and others who would carry their wounds for the rest of their lives. 500 missing, some confirmed captured, others simply vanished in combat where their fates couldn't be determined. Any bodies buried in unmarked graves or lost in forests where they would be discovered years later by farmers clearing land. The casualty rate of 56% exceeded rates from any previous 82nd Airborne operation, higher than Sicily, higher than Normandy, higher than Holland. The division had been tested more severely in the Ardennes than in any previous campaign, and had survived through determination and training, and the simple stubborn refusal to break regardless of casualties or conditions. Total encirclement eliminated approximately 100,000 German troops from the battlefield, losses that combined with casualties from earlier phases to represent nearly total destruction of German forces committed to the Ardennes offensive. German strategic result was catastrophic. An army group destroyed, AUK's equipment losses that exceeded production capacity for months, morale damage that spread throughout German forces as news of the defeat circulated, and strategic position that was worse after the offensive than before because German reserves had been consumed without achieving any compensation gains. Hitler's gamble had failed completely. The Ardennes offensive had not split Allied armies, had not captured Antwerp, had not forced negotiated settlement, had not bought time for miracle weapons to turn the tide. Instead, it had accelerated Germany's defeat by consuming the mobile reserves that should have been defending the Rhine, by demonstrating that German forces couldn't achieve breakthrough even when achieving surprise, and by forcing Germany into a purely defensive strategic posture where Allied material superiority guaranteed eventual victory. Gavin's final report to higher headquarters documented the 82nd's role in the campaign with characteristic understatement. Division deployed to Bastogne, December the 17th. Held defensive positions on northern and northeastern perimeter through December 26th. Participated in offensive operations, December 27th through January 25. Division casualties 56% of deployed strength. Mission accomplished. The report didn't mention the desperate defense against overwhelming German forces, the sustained combat in sub-zero temperatures, the soldiers who had frozen to death in foxholes, the wounded who had died because medical care was inadequate. Wann die Desestes assistes darigst, the replacements who had been killed before learning their unit's history, the 1,000 small acts of courage and competence that had enabled the division to function effectively despite conditions that should have broken less well-trained units. Military reports emphasized results over process, outcomes over experiences, statistics over human costs. Gavin understood this, but he also understood that behind every statistic was a soldier who had endured more than should be asked of any human being who had survived or died, based on factors that were often beyond their control, who had done their duty regardless of fear or exhaustion, or the terrible knowledge that they might die in a frozen Belgian forest fighting for ground that seemed to have no particular significance beyond the fact that someone had decided it needed to be held. American total casualties for the Ardennes campaign exceeded 80,000 killed, wounded, or missing, losses that represented the largest American casualty count for any single campaign in the European theater. The campaign had lasted approximately 6 weeks from initial German breakthrough on December 16th to final encirclement on January 25th. It had consumed resources that had been allocated for other operations. It had disrupted the Allied operational timeline by forcing armies to redirect from offensive to defensive operations, and then back to offensive. It had tested American command competence, logistics systems, replacement procedures, and combat effectiveness under conditions that were among the most challenging of the entire war. The campaign had been won, German forces destroyed, the Bulge eliminated from Allied lines. But victory had cost lives measured in tens of thousands, equipment losses measured in hundreds of vehicles and thousands of tons of supplies, and time that delayed the final advance into Germany by weeks that would eventually matter when measuring how long the war continued and how many additional casualties were incurred before victory was achieved. The 82nd's next operational mission would be defensive positions along the German border, while the division reconstituted, integrated replacements, repaired equipment, and prepared for spring offensives that would push into Germany itself. But that was future planning. In the present, soldiers who had survived the Ardennes campaign tried to process what they had experienced. All tried to make sense of 6 weeks that had tested them more severely than anything in their previous experience, tried to understand whether the cost had been justified by the outcome or whether they had simply been fortunate enough to survive a campaign that easily could have destroyed them. The encirclement was complete. The Ardennes campaign was effectively over, and somewhere in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, 6,000 American graves marked the price of victory, silent testimony to the cost of stopping Hitler's last great offensive and setting conditions for the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The war continued, but this chapter had ended, and the soldiers who survived would carry the memories of what they had endured for the rest of their lives. And memories of cold and fear and loss that would define them as men who had faced the worst that modern warfare could produce, and who had somehow, improbably, survived. February 1st, 1945. Bastogne Cemetery, Belgium. The chaplain's voice carried across rows of white crosses planted in frozen ground, reading names of men from the 82nd Airborne who had died during the campaign that was now being called the Battle of the Bulge. Private James Johnson, Corporal David Martinez, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, Sergeant Thomas Crawford, Captain Robert Dale. The names continued, 1,038 of them, each representing a life that had ended in snow-covered foxholes or burning vehicles or aid stations where medical care couldn't save men whose wounds were too severe. The surviving soldiers stood at attention in formation, breath visible in the cold air, listening to names of friends and leaders and strangers who had shared their experience but hadn't survived it. Some men cried openly. Others maintained the stoic expression that soldiers learned when confronting grief that was too overwhelming to process. The ceremony was brief because extended outdoor exposure in February weather risked additional cold weather casualties. But brevity didn't diminish the weight of what was being acknowledged. That victory had cost lives. That strategic success had required human sacrifice. That every white cross represented someone's son or brother or father who would never come home. A mother in Ohio received the telegram on a Tuesday morning in early February. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son, Private James Johnson, was killed in action in Belgium on December 19, 1944. The telegram included standard condolences about Johnson's service and sacrifice, bureaucratic language that attempted to make personal tragedy fit institutional templates designed for mass casualty notification. Johnson's mother would later receive his personal effects, a few letters he had written but never mailed, a photograph of his platoon taken before the offensive began, a combat infantry badge and Purple Heart that represented official recognition of his service. She would also receive letters from his squad leader and platoon sergeant, handwritten notes that attempted to provide context about how her son had died, assurances that he hadn't suffered, acknowledgments that he had been a good soldier and a valued member of his unit. The letters couldn't fill the absence. Nothing could. But they represented efforts by men who had survived to honor the memory of those who hadn't, to ensure that families understood their sons hadn't died alone or forgotten or without purpose, even when the purpose was sometimes hard to articulate clearly. Private Henderson, the replacement who had arrived in early January, received his Purple Heart during a brief ceremony in the aid station, where he was recovering from a shrapnel wound that had taken 3 fingers from his left hand. The wound would end his combat service but not kill him, a distinction that seemed arbitrary given that other men with similar wounds had died from infection or blood loss before receiving adequate medical care. Henderson stared at the medal and tried to understand what it represented. Recognition of sacrifice, compensation for loss, acknowledgement that he had been wounded serving his country. But the medal couldn't restore his fingers, couldn't eliminate the phantom pain that made him feel digits that were no longer attached to his hand, couldn't erase the memory of the explosion that had wounded him and killed the man standing next to him. The medal would go in a box in his parents' attic when he returned home, taken out occasionally to show children who would ask about the war, displayed briefly and then put away, because looking at it made him remember things he would rather forget. The physical cost of war was visible in wounds and scars. The psychological cost was invisible but equally real. Hopes carried by every survivor who closed their eyes at night and saw things that happened months or years or decades earlier, but which remained vivid with the terrible clarity that traumatic memory provides. Chaplain Miller had conducted 43 funeral services since December the 17th. Ceremonies that ranged from full military honors when time permitted to brief prayers said over bodies that needed to be buried quickly before moving to the next position. He had written letters to families attempting to provide comfort that he wasn't sure he believed, religious reassurances about eternal life and divine purpose that felt hollow when applied to 19-year-old soldiers who had died from bullets or cold, or the random chance that placed them in locations where German artillery happened to hit. Miller's faith had been tested by 6 weeks of sustained exposure to death, by the realization that prayer couldn't stop bullets or warm frozen bodies, or make any practical difference to whether soldiers lived or died. But he continued performing his duties because soldiers needed someone to acknowledge their loss, to provide the rituals that marked deaths, and made them mean something beyond statistics and casualty reports. After the Ardennes, Miller would request transfer from combat units to rear echelon assignments where he could minister to soldiers without watching them die. The request would be approved, but he would carry the memory of 43 funerals for the rest of his life, names and faces that he couldn't forget regardless of how much time passed. Gavin's reflection, documented in his personal journal, he captured the burden that commanders carried when tactical success required casualties. I lost 6,460 men in the Bulge. Some were killed instantly. Some died slowly from wounds we couldn't treat adequately. Some simply froze to death in foxholes where they were supposed to hold positions regardless of temperature. I ordered them into combat knowing that many would die. That's what command means in wartime, making decisions that trade lives for objectives, calculating acceptable casualty rates, continuing operations even when you know that continuation will kill men under your command. We won. We held Bastogne. We participated in destroying a German army group. The strategic outcome justified the operation by conventional military logic. But each of those 6,460 casualties was someone's son. Each had a family that will receive a telegram. Each had a life that ended because I ordered them into combat. I don't know how to reconcile strategic success with personal grief. I don't know if I'm supposed to. I just know that command in wartime means carrying the weight of decisions that kill people, and that weight doesn't get lighter regardless of whether the operation succeeded. Total 82nd. Airborne casualties for the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 6,400 when accounting for all categories. 1,038 killed in action, 4,922 wounded severely enough to require medical evacuation, 500 missing or captured. The wounded category included men with relatively minor injuries who would return to duty after brief recovery, and men with catastrophic trauma who would never function normally again. Amputations, blindness, traumatic brain injuries, burns that covered significant portions of their bodies. Medical technology in 1945 could save lives that would have been lost in earlier wars, but saving lives didn't mean restoring normalcy. Many wounded soldiers would carry their injuries permanently, would require ongoing medical care, would struggle with employment and relationships, and the simple physical challenges of living with damaged bodies. The casualty statistics represented not just immediate losses, but lifetime costs, soldiers whose service would affect everything that followed, who would approach marriage and employment and family life as men shaped fundamentally by their wartime experiences. Non-combat casualties added another 2,000 cold weather injuries and disease cases to the division's loss statistics. Men whose feet or hands required amputation from frostbite, who developed pneumonia that damaged their lungs permanently, who suffered from trench foot that left them unable to walk normally even after the immediate infection healed. These casualties were often minimized in official accounts that emphasized combat losses over environmental injuries. But from the perspective of soldiers who experienced them, cold weather casualties were as devastating as combat wounds, removing men from their units, ending their combat service, creating permanent disabilities that would affect their entire lives. The Army's official position was that adequate cold weather precautions would have prevented many of these injuries, that soldiers who followed proper procedures for foot care and warming could avoid frostbite and trench foot. The reality was that proper procedures were often impossible to follow in combat conditions, where maintaining defensive positions required staying in frozen foxholes for days without rotation, where dry socks and warming facilities were luxuries that frontline units couldn't access, where survival meant accepting cold weather injuries as the price of maintaining defensive positions. Replacement losses during January told a particularly tragic story. Of the 3,000 replacements who joined the 82nd during the campaign, approximately 800 became casualties before they could be fully integrated into their units, killed or wounded before they learned the practical skills that separated survivors from statistics, before they understood how to function in combat effectively. The replacement casualty rate was significantly higher than the veteran casualty rate, confirming what experienced soldiers already knew. Combat had a learning curve, and learning took time that replacements didn't always have. Some replacements arrived and died within days, killed in their first firefight, or by their first exposure to German artillery. Others survived long enough to gain some experience, but were wounded before becoming truly effective soldiers. The few who survived and learned became the veterans who would train the next group of replacements in an endless cycle that continued until the war finally ended and the killing stopped. Long-term impact on surviving paratroopers couldn't be adequately assessed in February 1945 because the concept of PTSD didn't exist, and because the war was still continuing, and because soldiers were expected to process their experiences internally rather than seeking external support. But decades later, researchers studying veterans from the Battle of the Bulge would document that over 90% reported lasting psychological effects. Nightmares about combat experiences, anxiety reactions to loud noises that reminded them of artillery, difficulty forming close relationships because everyone they had been close to in combat had died. It's survivor guilt about living when so many others hadn't. The psychological cost of the campaign would persist long after physical wounds healed, affecting marriages and employment and mental health in ways that the soldiers themselves often couldn't articulate clearly. The generation that fought World War II was often characterized as stoic and uncomplaining about their service. But stoicism didn't mean absence of psychological impact. It meant carrying that impact privately, struggling with memories and emotions that had no adequate outlet in a culture that valued strength over vulnerability, and which expected veterans to simply move on rather than dwelling on wartime experiences. February 1st, 1945, marked approximately 6 weeks since the campaign began. Bastogne had become symbolic of American determination. The town's defense frequently referenced in newspaper accounts and military reports as proof that American soldiers could stand against overwhelming odds and prevail. The 82nd's role was acknowledged in official dispatches and would eventually be documented in unit histories and campaign analyses. But for the soldiers who had actually fought there, Bastogne was less about symbolism than about specific memories. The weight of equipment carried through snow, the sound of German artillery, the faces of friends who died, the taste of cold rations eaten in frozen foxholes, the feeling of fear and exhaustion, and the desperate hope that you would survive one more day. The symbolic importance would be constructed later by historians and journalists and politicians who needed the campaign to mean something beyond the brutal reality of 6 weeks in winter combat. The men who fought there didn't need symbolism. They needed warmth and rest and some way to process what they had experienced. They needed to understand how to continue living when part of them had died in Belgian forests. They needed to reconcile the pride of having survived with the guilt of surviving when others hadn't. The price of victory was measured in white crosses planted in frozen ground. It was measured in telegrams that would arrive at homes across America announcing deaths. It was measured in wounded men who would carry their injuries for life. It was measured in psychological trauma that wouldn't be recognized or treated adequately for decades. The 82nd had won. The strategic outcome justified the operation. But 6,460 soldiers had paid the price for that victory, and their sacrifice would resonate through families and communities for generations. A reminder that military success always comes with human cost that extends far beyond the battlefield where the fighting occurred. November 10th, 1994. Bastogne, Belgium. 50th anniversary. Private James Johnson would have been 70 years old if he had survived. Instead, his name was engraved on a memorial stone in Bastogne, alongside 1,037 other 82nd Airborne soldiers who had died during the winter of 1944 and 45. His sister, now 68 herself, stood before the memorial with her children and grandchildren, trying to explain what her brother had died for, why this small Belgian town mattered enough that thousands of young men had frozen or bled to death defending it. The explanation was difficult because the strategic rationale, controlling road networks to prevent German breakthrough, felt abstract compared to the concrete reality of a 20-year-old who had been killed by artillery fire on December 19th, 50 years ago. Her children listened politely and asked appropriate questions, but she knew they couldn't really understand that the distance between 1994 and 1944 was more than chronological, that the world her brother had died in was fundamentally different from the world her grandchildren inhabited. The memorial was important. The pilgrimage to Bastogne was important. But nothing could bridge the gap between memory and lived experience, between honoring sacrifice and truly understanding what that sacrifice had cost. An 80-year-old veteran stood touching a statue of an American paratrooper, his hand trembling not just from age but from emotion that had accumulated over 5 decades. He had been here in 1944, had held defensive positions north of town, had watched friends die in circumstances that he could still remember with painful clarity. The Bastogne he remembered was frozen and burning, filled with the sounds of artillery and small arms fire and wounded men calling for medics. The Bastogne of 1994 was peaceful and prosperous, rebuilt after the destruction, populated by people who had been born decades after the battle ended. The contrast was disorienting. He appreciated that the town remembered, that memorials had been erected, that ceremonies acknowledged American sacrifice. But he also felt the distance between memory and commemoration, between what had actually happened and how it was being remembered. The ceremonies emphasized heroism and determination. His memories emphasized fear and cold, and the arbitrary nature of survival, where men who did everything right still died, while others who made mistakes survived. Both versions were true, but they described different aspects of the same experience, and the gap between them felt unbridgeable. Modern 82nd Airborne paratroopers attended the anniversary as official representatives of the division. 8 young men in their 20s who had joined a unit with a history that predated their births, who wore the same unit patches that soldiers had worn in 1944, but who inhabited a military culture that had evolved significantly in 50 years. They participated in ceremonies and listened respectfully to veterans and tried to understand what it had been like to fight in conditions they could barely imagine. Their training emphasized modern weapons systems, counterinsurgency tactics, operations in diverse terrain from deserts to jungles. The winter defensive combat that had defined the Battle of the Bulge felt historical rather than relevant to their probable combat experiences. But they understood that unit tradition mattered, that the 82nd's reputation had been forged in battles like Bastogne, that they carried responsibility for maintaining standards established by men who had fought in conditions that tested human endurance to its limits. The connection between 1944 and 1994 was maintained through ceremony and institutional memory, and the simple fact that the same unit designation connected soldiers across 5 decades of profound social and military change. Documentary footage of other Bulge campaigns shown during anniversary commemorations placed the 82nd's experience in broader context. The 101st Airborne had also fought at Bastogne, had suffered similar casualties, had earned similar recognition for their defense. Other divisions had fought in different sectors of the Ardennes, had their own stories of desperate defense and costly offensive operations. The Battle of the Bulge involved over 600,000 American soldiers across dozens of divisions, artillery battalions, tank destroyers units, support formations. The 82nd's contribution was significant, but represented one piece of a much larger operation, where success required coordinated efforts across an entire theater. The tendency in unit histories was to emphasize individual division contributions and minimize the broader context. But accurate historical understanding required acknowledging that no single unit won the battle. That victory emerged from collective effort, where logistics and artillery and air power and infantry combat all contributed to the eventual German defeat. The 82nd had held Bastogne's northern perimeter. That achievement mattered. But it mattered as part of a larger defensive success that involved multiple divisions and supporting units working toward common objectives. Final reflection during the anniversary ceremony emphasized themes that had become central to American understanding of the Battle of the Bulge: determination in the face of overwhelming odds, adaptability when facing unexpected crisis, resilience under extreme conditions, and ultimately, triumph over an enemy that had achieved complete surprise and nearly succeeded before American forces contained and then destroyed the German offensive. These themes served important cultural functions, providing narratives that emphasized American military competence and soldier courage, creating stories that could be remembered and honored and passed down to subsequent generations. But the veterans listening to these reflections knew that the reality had been more complicated, that determination had sometimes looked like paralyzing fear, that adaptability had sometimes meant chaos, that resilience had sometimes been simply the inability to give up, even when giving up seemed rational. The official narratives weren't wrong, but they were simplified, refined, shaped into forms that could be commemorated publicly, while the messier truths remained private memories that veterans shared rarely and only with others who had experienced similar combat. Bastonia's symbolic importance in American military culture became evident in how frequently the town's defense was referenced in subsequent conflicts. During Vietnam, when American forces held fire bases against overwhelming enemy attacks, commanders invoked Bastogne as proof that surrounded Americans could prevail. During the Gulf War, when briefing officers described coalition strategy, they referenced the Ardennes as an example of successful defense against armored assault. During Iraq and Afghanistan, when discussing resilience under difficult conditions, military leaders cited the 82nd and 101st Airborne at Bastogne as exemplars of how elite units performed when tested. The symbolic Bastogne bore limited resemblance to the historical Bastogne, where cold had killed as many men as combat, and where survival had often depended more on luck than skill. But symbols serve different functions than history. Symbols provide inspiration and identity and continuity across time. As history provides complexity and ambiguity, and the recognition that real events rarely conform to simple narratives. Both had value, both were necessary, but they shouldn't be confused with each other. The 82nd's post-Bulge history traced a line from the campaign through subsequent decades of military operations. After Germany's defeat, the division participated in occupation duties, then became a core element of Cold War rapid deployment forces, then fought in Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and numerous smaller operations across 7 decades. The division's identity became inseparable from its history, with Bastogne representing a foundational moment that established the unit's reputation for effectiveness under extreme conditions. Soldiers joining the 82nd in the 21st century learned about Bastogne during their orientation, studied the campaign in professional development courses, understood that they were joining a unit whose standards had been established by men who had fought in conditions that tested human limits. The connection between past and present was maintained through institutional memory, through ceremonies and memorials, through the simple fact that the same unit designation connected soldiers across time, even as weapons and tactics and the nature of warfare evolved dramatically. Military studies of the Battle of the Bulge emphasized multiple lessons that remained relevant decades after the campaign ended. The importance of logistics in sustaining operations when supply lines were disrupted. The value of small unit leadership when higher headquarters lost contact and soldiers had to function independently. The reality that tactical surprise was always possible regardless of intelligence capabilities. That complacency represented a constant danger. That assumptions about enemy capabilities could prove catastrophically wrong. The recognition that soldiers who were adequately trained and properly led could absorb casualties and continue functioning, even under conditions that seemed overwhelming. These lessons were documented in staff college curricula, discussed in professional military education, incorporated into doctrine that shaped how American forces trained and fought. The Bulge became a case study, an example that could be analyzed for insights about defensive operations, coalition warfare, logistics management, and leadership under crisis conditions. The academic study of the campaign served different purposes than personal memory, emphasizing patterns and principles rather than individual experiences, seeking generalizable lessons rather than preserving specific details. Historical interpretation of the Battle of the Bulge evolved significantly between 1945 and the 50th anniversary in 1994. Initial post-war accounts emphasized dramatic narratives of heroic defense and crushing German defeat, celebrating American success while minimizing the reality that German forces had achieved complete surprise and had nearly succeeded in splitting Allied armies. By the 1960s and 70s, historians began acknowledging Allied intelligence failures, examining why warning signs had been missed, assessing whether the crisis could have been prevented through better analysis of German capabilities. By the 1980s and 90s, scholarship had shifted toward more nuanced understanding that acknowledged both American success in containing the German offensive and the significant costs that success required, recognizing that the campaign represented neither unqualified triumph nor near disaster, but rather a complex operation where both sides made mistakes and where the eventual outcome reflected material advantages more than tactical brilliance. The evolution of historical understanding demonstrated that what we remember about events changes over time, shaped by subsequent experiences, influenced by shifting cultural values, and refined by access to documents and perspectives that weren't available immediately after events occurred. What American military culture learned from the Battle of the Bulge that remained applicable decades later centered on several key insights. First, that elite units justified their existence not through normal operations, but through crisis performance. That the investment in creating highly trained formations like the 82nd Airborne paid dividends when those units faced situations that would break less prepared forces. Second, that logistics ultimately determined operational outcomes more than tactical skill. That the most brilliant combat leadership couldn't compensate for inadequate supplies. That American advantages in industrial production and supply chain management represented strategic capabilities that enemy forces couldn't match through tactical excellence. Third, that soldiers would endure extraordinary hardship and continue fighting effectively if they trusted their leaders, believed in their unit, and understood that their sacrifice served meaningful purposes. That maintaining morale and unit cohesion under terrible conditions required leadership that was competent, visible, and willing to share the same risks that enlisted soldiers faced. These lessons weren't unique to the Bulge, but the campaign provided a particularly clear example of how they manifested in actual combat operations, making it a useful reference point for subsequent generations of military leaders. The question of how to honor sacrifice while acknowledging cost remained difficult 50 years after the campaign. The memorials in Bastogne emphasized valor and determination, appropriate themes for public commemoration, but incomplete representations of what soldiers had actually experienced. The private memories that veterans carried included fear and suffering and loss that didn't fit easily into heroic narratives, experiences that were important to remember but difficult to discuss in settings designed for celebration rather than grief. The tension between public commemoration and private memory was never fully resolved. Ceremonies acknowledged sacrifice and expressed gratitude. But gratitude couldn't restore lives, couldn't eliminate the pain that families carried, or couldn't answer the question of whether the specific objective of holding Bastogne had been worth the specific costs of 6,000 American casualties. The answer depended on perspective, on whether you measured worth in strategic terms or human terms, on whether you believed that military necessity justified individual sacrifice, or whether you thought that human life should be valued above strategic objectives. Veterans tended to accept that their sacrifice had been necessary because the alternative was concluding that their friends had died for nothing, an idea too painful to accept. But acceptance didn't eliminate ambivalence, didn't prevent questions from arising late at night when memories returned with uncomfortable clarity. The meaning of victory, when measured against the price paid for it, or it became the central question that connected 1944 to 1994 and beyond. The 82nd Airborne had won. German forces had been defeated. The Bulge had been eliminated, and German armies pushed back toward the Reich. These were objective facts, confirmable through historical records and military archives. But what did victory mean to Private Johnson's sister, standing at his memorial 50 years after his death? What did it mean to the veteran touching the statue, remembering friends who hadn't survived to see this anniversary? What did it mean to families who had received telegrams in February 1945 announcing deaths? The strategic answer was clear. Holding Bastogne had been essential to containing the German offensive, preventing breakthrough that might have prolonged the war. It's contributing to the eventual Allied victory that ended Nazi Germany's threat to civilization. The personal answer was more complicated. Victory meant loss, meant grief that didn't diminish over decades, meant lives that had been fundamentally shaped by what had happened during 6 weeks in winter when young men had fought and died in frozen Belgian forests. The ceremony concluded with playing of taps, the mournful bugle call that had accompanied military funerals since the American Civil War. Notes that carried across rows of white crosses and through the assembly of veterans and family members and officials who had gathered to remember. The music was simple and profound, capturing something about sacrifice and loss that words couldn't express adequately. When the final note faded, a silence fell that was broken only by wind moving through the memorial grounds. Then people began dispersing, returning to buses and hotels, carrying their memories and their grief and their pride in ways that were private and personal and resistant to public expression. Bastogne would continue to be remembered. The 82nd Airborne's legacy would endure. But the men who had actually fought there would continue to carry burdens that commemoration could acknowledge but never fully share. Memories that defined them even as they built lives in the decades after the war ended. The price of victory had been paid in 1944 and 45. But it was being paid again in every nightmare, every moment of survivor guilt, every family gathering where sons and brothers and fathers were absent. The military historians would debate tactical decisions and strategic implications. Families would remember human beings who had been loved and lost. Both perspectives were valid, both mattered. And somewhere in the gap between them lay the true legacy of the Battle of the Bulge, not just that Americans had fought and won, but that winning had required sacrifice that rippled through generations, shaping families and communities, and a nation's understanding of what service and duty and courage actually cost when measured in human terms rather than strategic objectives. The memorial stood silent. The names remained engraved, and the legacy endured, complicated and painful and proud. A reminder that victory in war is never simple and never cheap, that freedom is preserved through sacrifice that extends far beyond the battlefield. That honoring those who serve requires remembering not just their triumph, but their suffering, not just their success, but their cost, not just their legacy, but their humanity.